The trunk is already closed by the time you come into the room. Brass latches, 6 of them, pressed shut by a maid who did not ask what you wanted folded on top. The cabin trunk stands upright by the door like something waiting to be introduced. It smells of new leather and faintly of the cedar closet it came from, a smell that will cling to your good dresses for the whole crossing. Outside the window the carriage is already at the curb. The horse shifts its weight and the harness answers with a small, patient sound. It is early. The street is the colour of pewter, the gas lamps not yet out, and the house behind you is so quiet you can hear the clock in the hall counting the minutes you have left in it. You are 41 years old. You have run this house for 19 years. You know which floorboard in the upstairs hall announces a step before the step is finished, which window sticks in August, which cook's temper turns with the weather. None of that is being asked of you this morning. This morning you are only asked to be ready, and you are. Your husband is not at the door to see you off. He is at the breakfast table, the newspaper open in front of him, and when you pause in the doorway to say goodbye, he says it is for your health, that the doctor recommended the change of air, that Europe in autumn is supposed to be very restorative. He does not look up when he says it. He has already said it 3 times this week, each time with slightly less inflection, the way a person repeats a fact they have decided not to examine too closely. The maid carries down the smaller case. The trunk with the brass latches will follow separately, already addressed, already claimed by a steamship line and a stateroom number that someone else selected. You step into the carriage. The door closes with the soft, final sound of a door that has closed this way for other women on other mornings, in other houses along other quiet streets. Somewhere behind you, in a room you will not see again for a long while, the house exhales. It has been holding its breath around you for months without your noticing. Now it can begin, quietly, to become something else. You are on a ship now, though you do not remember choosing it. The berth is narrow, the porthole small and round as a coin, and beyond the glass the last grey edge of America is folding itself into the horizon. This will happen to a great many women exactly like you between the end of the Civil War and the first years of the new century. Not girls being sent to find husbands, not debutantes being groomed for a season of dances and introductions. Wives. Women who had already done the thing they were raised to do, who had already married well and borne children and managed households of a size and complexity that would exhaust a small corporation, and who were now, somewhere in their 40s, being quietly removed from the houses they had built. The word used at the time was rarely exile, though that is closer to the truth than anyone wanted to say aloud. The word used was rest, or restoration, or more delicately still, finishing, as though a woman who had already raised a family and hosted a decade of dinners still had some remaining polish to acquire, some last coat of European lacquer that only Paris or Baden-Baden could provide. The doctors had a word too, a newer and more scientific-sounding one, and it will come up often in the pages ahead. Neurasthenia, a nervous exhaustion, a modern malady, fashionable enough that half of Fifth Avenue believed in it, and useful enough that the other half found it convenient to prescribe. You will notice, as this story unfolds, how rarely anyone asks what the wife herself believed was wrong with her. The diagnosis, in most cases, did not originate with her. It originated in a conversation she was not present for, between a husband and a physician, in a study with the door closed, and by the time it reached her it had already become a fact rather than a suggestion. The trunks were already being packed by the time she was told she needed rest. There is no cruelty in the telling of this that requires raised voices. That is, in some ways, the most unsettling part of it. Nobody shouted, nobody accused. The furniture was not overturned, the china was not broken, no one wept in a hallway where the servants could hear. It was managed the way everything in that world was managed, with correct handwriting and a doctor's signature, and a steamship ticket booked 3 weeks in advance. Cruelty, in this particular story, wore very good gloves. You will meet several women in the chapters ahead, women who existed, whose names appear in ship manifests and hotel registers, and the quiet correspondence of physicians who treated the wealthy. You will follow them onto the liners, into the spa towns of Baden-Baden and Vichy and Carlsbad, through the strange floating society of other exiled wives who found each other on hotel terraces and recognized, without needing to say it, exactly what had happened to each of them. And you will follow at a distance what happened in the houses they left behind, because that story runs alongside this one the entire way, quiet and parallel, like a second train on a track you cannot quite see. None of it needs your alarm. It happened a long time ago, to women who are gone now, and the worst of it is already over. What it asks of you tonight is only what any old story asks of a listener at this hour. That you let it move slowly, that you let the ship find its rhythm on the water, that you let your body settle the way a house settles after everyone inside it has finally gone quiet. The engines have found their pace below you now, a low, steady thrum through the floor of the cabin, patient as a heartbeat that is not your own but that you can borrow for a while. Somewhere above, on the promenade deck, the last of the passengers are coming in out of the cold. The coastline is gone. There is only water now and the sound of the water and the long, unhurried dark ahead. In the study, the conversation that decided your crossing did not take very long. 15 minutes, perhaps 20. Long enough for the physician to accept a small glass of sherry and decline a second. Long enough for your husband to describe, in the careful vocabulary of a man reciting something he has rehearsed, the things he had noticed. That you were tired in the afternoons, that you had grown quiet at dinner, that you had on more than one occasion forgotten a small errand you would once have remembered without effort. The physician nodded through most of it. He had heard versions of this description perhaps 100 times that year alone, from 100 husbands sitting in 100 nearly identical chairs, and he had a word ready for it before the description was even finished. Neurasthenia, a weakness of the nerves. It was by the last decades of the century one of the most fashionable diagnoses in American medicine, so widely applied that a person could develop it from working too hard or from working too little, from too much society or too little of it, from grief, from boredom, from the ordinary friction of being a woman who ran a household of 11 servants and 4 children, and a husband who required, in his own quiet way, a 5th kind of management entirely. The symptoms, as the doctors of the period listed them, were almost comically broad. Fatigue, irritability, a certain vagueness of attention, sleeplessness, or its opposite, an excess of sleep, headache, a loss of appetite, or an increase in it. In practice, the diagnosis could be draped over nearly any woman a husband wished to have examined, because the examination rarely began with the woman at all. It began with his account of her, delivered in a room she was not invited into, to a man who had every professional incentive to agree with the person paying his fee. This was not, in the medical understanding of the time, considered dishonest. The nervous system, in the framework popularised by the neurologist George Beard some decades earlier, was believed to function something like a bank account. A person was born with a fixed store of nervous energy, and every demand made upon it, work, emotion, the strain of managing a household, was a withdrawal. Spend too freely and the account emptied. The formally educated, the socially prominent, the financially comfortable, were held to be especially vulnerable, their nerves refined past the coarse endurance of labourers and farm wives who were assumed, conveniently, to be too busy for their nerves to trouble them. A woman of your position, then, was diagnosed almost by category. Wealth itself was treated as a kind of exposure. The very drawing rooms and dinner parties that were supposed to be the reward for a life well married were reframed, in the physician's language, as a drain upon a delicate constitution. It was, if you sit with it, a remarkably tidy piece of reasoning. The symptoms of an unhappy marriage, of a life spent managing someone else's ambitions, of decades without a single decision made entirely on your own behalf, could all be absorbed into a diagnosis that asked nothing of the marriage and everything of the wife. The remedy, once the word had been spoken, followed a familiar shape. Rest, a change of air, and, for those who could afford it, which in this story is always the case, a change of continent. Europe held a peculiar authority in American medicine of the period, an assumption that the Old World's waters, its climate, its slower rhythms, possessed a curative power the New World simply could not manufacture. A rest taken in Newport was a rest. A rest taken in Baden-Baden was treatment. You were not in the room for any of this. You learned of the diagnosis the way most women of your circumstance learned of it, second hand, delivered by your husband over breakfast, with the particular gentleness men used when they had already made a decision and only needed you to agree to it. He would have used the word tired. He would have mentioned the doctor's concern. He would not, in all likelihood, have used the word neurasthenia at all, because the word itself was less important than the outcome it authorized. There is a version of this story in which the diagnosis was offered with real tenderness, in which a husband genuinely believed his wife was unwell and genuinely wished her restored. That version exists, and it is worth holding on to because not every husband in this history was calculating. Some were simply following the only script available to them, a script in which a wife's exhaustion was a medical problem rather than a marital one, and in which the correct response to a woman's unhappiness was a steamship ticket rather than a conversation. But there is another version, quieter and more common than the record likes to admit, in which the diagnosis served a second purpose entirely. A wife sent abroad for her nerves was a wife removed from the house without a scandal attached to her leaving. No one asked pointed questions about a woman taking the cure in Europe. It was respectable. It was in its way even enviable, spoken of at dinner parties with a note of solicitous envy. She's gone to Baden-Baden for her health. How restful that must be. What the phrase did not include, what it was specifically designed not to include, was any account of what the husband intended to do with the house in her absence, who might begin visiting in her place, what redecoration might occur, what letters might arrive addressed to him and only him while she took the waters 3,000 miles away. The diagnosis solved two problems with a single word, and only one of those problems belonged to her. You will meet, in the chapters that follow, several women who carried this exact diagnosis onto ships very much like the one you're on now. Their names survive in ship manifests, in the ledgers of European hotels that catered specifically to what the proprietors delicately called invalid guests, in the correspondence of physicians who treated the same families for generations and left behind, without quite meaning to, a record of how often the treatment for a wife's unhappiness was distance. It is worth sitting for a moment with how thoroughly this arrangement removed a woman from her own diagnosis. She did not choose the word used to describe her condition. She did not choose the physician who applied it. She did not in most cases choose the destination, the hotel, the length of the stay, or the companion who would travel with her to ensure she did not go anywhere or see anyone unsupervised. Every element of her own convalescence was arranged by other people, for reasons that were only sometimes about her. And yet, and this is the part of the story that resists easy anger, many of these women did not resist the arrangement. Some welcomed it. A ship, however involuntary its booking, was still a ship, and it was still, for the first time in perhaps 2 decades, taking her somewhere without a child needing her, a guest list requiring her attention, a household ledger waiting to be balanced. Whatever the diagnosis actually was, whatever its intentions, the rest itself was frequently real, and frequently, quietly, welcome. Consider, for a moment, the physician's own position in this arrangement, because he too was operating inside a set of pressures that shaped his judgment, more than the era's confident medical language liked to admit. He depended, for his livelihood and his reputation, on the continued goodwill of the wealthy families who retained him, families like yours, whose patronage could sustain a practice for a generation if managed carefully, or end it within a season if a physician proved too independent in his conclusions. A doctor who told a prominent husband that his wife's exhaustion stemmed from the marriage itself, rather than from her nerves, was a doctor risking exactly the kind of awkward, unrewarded honesty that tended not to secure repeat business. There were, of course, physicians of real conscience within this system, men who took their oath seriously enough to examine a patient thoroughly before accepting a husband's account at face value, who asked a wife directly about her sleep and her appetite and her state of mind rather than simply confirming what they had already been told. But even these more careful physicians operated within a diagnostic vocabulary that had been built, largely by other men, around assumptions about female fragility that made almost any account of exhaustion legible as a nervous complaint rather than a social one. The vocabulary itself was the constraint, regardless of the individual physician's intentions. It is worth noting, too, how differently this same fatigue was treated when it appeared in women outside your particular class. A farm wife exhausted by physical labour and childbearing rarely received a diagnosis at all, let alone a prescribed season at a European spa. Her exhaustion was simply assumed to be the ordinary condition of her circumstances, unremarkable, undiagnosed, unaddressed by any physician because no one thought to send for one. Neurasthenia in this sense was less a universal medical category than a particular language reserved for a particular class of woman, one whose husband could afford both the diagnosis and its expensive remedy. This selective application of the diagnosis reveals something important about what the word was actually doing in the culture of the period. It was not simply naming an illness, it was performing a kind of social sorting, distinguishing between forms of female suffering worth treating and forms considered too ordinary, too expected, to merit any treatment at all. A wealthy woman's exhaustion became a medical event precisely because her husband's resources made the elaborate response possible, while an identical exhaustion in a poorer household remained invisible, absorbed silently into the unremarked rhythm of daily survival. None of this would have been on your mind, particularly in the actual moment the diagnosis was delivered to you. In that moment, there was only the strange, disorienting experience of being told, gently and with apparent concern, that something was wrong with you, something serious enough to warrant an ocean crossing, delivered by the one person who had spent the most time with you, and yet somehow had not thought to ask you first what you believed the trouble actually was. The medical journals of the period, when read now in sequence across the decades this story spans, show the diagnosis of neurasthenia evolving in its particulars even as its underlying function remained remarkably stable. Early formulations of the condition emphasized overwork and intellectual strain, a framing that suited the era's growing anxiety about the pace of industrial and urban life. Later formulations broadened considerably, folding in an ever wider array of symptoms until the diagnosis had become, in the words of one skeptical physician writing near the century's end, capable of explaining nearly anything a patient might present with, from genuine physical illness to what he delicately termed simple domestic unhappiness. This elasticity was, in a sense, the diagnosis's most useful feature, at least from the perspective of the husbands and physicians who relied upon it. A condition capable of explaining nearly any complaint was also a condition that required no especially precise account of what had actually gone wrong. A husband did not need to articulate, even to himself, the specific ways his own behaviour or his own neglect might have contributed to his wife's exhaustion. He needed only to observe that she seemed unwell, in whatever vague sense unwell might mean on a given afternoon, and the diagnostic apparatus available to him would supply the rest. It is worth imagining the alternative conversations that almost never occurred within these households, conversations in which a husband might have asked his wife directly what would actually help her, whether that meant more household help, more of his own direct involvement in decisions that had fallen entirely to her, or simply more acknowledgement of the labour she performed daily without any expectation of thanks. Such conversations required a kind of vulnerability and a kind of genuine curiosity about a wife's inner life that the social conventions of the period rarely modelled for men of this class, raised as most of them were within a domestic arrangement that treated a wife's management of the household as simply the natural, uncomplicated order of things, requiring no particular gratitude or examination. There is one more thread worth following before this chapter closes, the question of what a woman herself believed privately about her own condition when she was finally given the chance to reflect on it without an audience. A handful of diary entries from this period, written after the diagnosis had been delivered but before the crossing began, show women testing the word neurasthenia against their own felt experience, sometimes accepting it, sometimes quietly rejecting it in the privacy of their own pages, even while outwardly complying with the treatment it prescribed. One woman, writing in a diary now held in a small regional archive, noted simply that she did not feel weak so much as unseen, a distinction the medical vocabulary of her era had no room to hold. There is also the quieter matter of how this diagnosis interacted with a woman's own sense of her worth within the marriage that had produced it. To be told that your labour, sustained faithfully across 2 decades, had somehow damaged your own constitution beyond safe continuation, was to receive a message considerably more complicated than a simple medical concern. It suggested, however unintentionally, that the household's smooth operation had come at a cost measured in her own health, a cost no one had thought to calculate or acknowledge until it had accumulated past the point of easy denial. And yet the remedy offered no correction to the underlying arrangement that had produced the cost in the first place. It offered only removal, temporary and geographically distant from the arrangement itself, with every expectation that she would return, eventually, to resume exactly the labour that had exhausted her. It is worth remembering as this chapter closes that the diagnosis did not exist in isolation. It belonged to a much broader cultural moment in which the entire concept of the modern nervous system was being reimagined, industrial society itself understood by many physicians and social commentators of the era as a kind of collective strain on the human constitution, telegraph wires and railway schedules, and the accelerating pace of urban life all implicated in a general anxiety about whether the human body could keep pace with its own inventions. Neurasthenia, in this larger context, was not invented specifically to manage wives. It was a broader anxiety of the age, applied, in this particular case, to a population whose exhaustion happened to serve a convenient secondary purpose once the diagnosis reached her husband's study. And so the diagnosis, whatever its flaws, becomes in this story less a villain to be condemned outright than a door, however strangely built, however poorly labelled, that opened onto something these women needed and had no other sanctioned way to reach. It is worth, finally, letting go of the impulse to resolve this history into a tidy moral before the ship carries you any further, since the women who lived it were rarely afforded the luxury of a tidy resolution themselves, and the honest telling of their story owes them, at minimum, the same patience they were so rarely given. There is a further point worth dwelling on, the way this entire system managed to feel, to nearly everyone participating in it, like an act of care rather than an act of control, a distinction that mattered enormously to how comfortably it could be sustained across generations without significant challenge. A husband who believed himself to be caring for his wife's health could proceed with a clear conscience through an arrangement that, examined from another angle, functioned considerably more like a removal than a remedy. This is perhaps the most durable trick any system of quiet control can perform, convincing its own architects that they are engaged in kindness. Sit with that for a moment longer before the chapter turns. Kindness and control in this particular history so often wore the same gloves. Sit with that for a moment longer before the chapter turns. Kindness and control in this particular history so often wore the same gloves, and untangling one from the other required a kind of scrutiny that almost no one within these households, husband or wife or physician, had any real incentive to perform. It was simply easier for everyone involved to call the whole arrangement care and let the word do the work that a harder, more honest conversation never got the chance to do. None of it required your alarm then, and none of it requires your alarm now, only your patient attention as the ship carries you further still into the story ahead. Somewhere in the ship's hold, the trunk carries forward everything that could be packed. Everything else, the harder things, travel with her differently, unpacked, unlabelled, held quietly in whatever part of a person carries what luggage cannot. There is comfort even now in simply naming what happened plainly, without flinching and without exaggeration, and letting the plain naming itself be enough for tonight. The waters below the hull tonight do not know any of this history. They simply carry the ship forward, the way they carried every one of these women forward, toward hotels with high ceilings and slow mornings, and doctors who spoke in French and German and prescribed mineral baths instead of household ledgers. Whatever the word neurasthenia was invented to disguise, it is also true that a tired woman, whatever the true cause of her tiredness, was finally, after all those years, being told to rest. Let the engines carry that thought for you now. Not the injustice of it, not yet, only the fact of the rest itself, arriving however strangely it arrived, however late. Somewhere in a file that no longer exists, or exists only in an archive no one thinks to search, there was very likely a letter. Physician to physician, or physician to husband, confirming a diagnosis that had already been decided before the appointment began. This was, in the medical culture of the period, an unremarkable piece of correspondence. Doctors who treated the wealthy families of New York and Philadelphia and Boston knew one another, referred patients to one another, and shared in their private letters an easy confidence that a man's account of his wife's condition could generally be trusted more than the wife's own account of herself. It is worth pausing on the mechanics of this, because the mechanics are the story. A wife who complained of exhaustion to her husband was, in this arrangement, simply a wife complaining. The same complaint relayed by the husband to a physician became a symptom, and the physician's response, relayed back to the husband, became a diagnosis, one that the wife would receive only after it had already passed through two other people, both men, both invested in a particular outcome, before it ever reached her. There was a name for this triangulated authority in later feminist scholarship, though the women living through it in 1888 or 1894 had no such vocabulary available to them. They only had the felt experience of it. the sense that their own account of their bodies and their days was somehow less reliable than an account given by someone who was not living inside either. A husband did not need to be dishonest for this system to work in his favour. He needed only to describe his wife the way he saw her, filtered through his own frustrations, his own convenience, his own growing interest in an evening that did not include her, and the medical establishment would do the rest. Consider what such a letter might actually have said, drawing from the kind of language physicians of the period used freely in their casebooks. The patient exhibits a marked lassitude inconsistent with her domestic responsibilities. She has grown inattentive to household matters previously well within her capability. Her temperament has become, in her husband's account, difficult to predict. The recommendation, nearly always, followed a template as fixed as a form letter, removal from the present environment, a programme of rest, ideally at one of the recognised continental spas for a period of not less than 3 months. 3 months. It is worth letting that number sit for a moment, because 3 months was rarely the actual length of these absences. Once a wife had crossed the Atlantic, once she had settled into the rhythm of a spa town, and the physician there had rendered his own opinion, the original 3 months had a way of becoming 4, then 6, then a full season, stretched across 2 countries and 2 sets of waters, each extension arriving by letter, each letter carrying the same reassuring, immovable authority of medical necessity. The wife, for her part, generally had no direct channel of appeal. She could write home, and she did, letters full of questions about the children and the household, and delicately about when she might be permitted to return. But those letters travelled by the same slow steamship post that had carried her away, taking 2 weeks or more each direction, so that any question she asked in October would not receive an answer until nearly Thanksgiving, by which point the question itself, and the woman who asked it, had drifted further from the centre of the household's attention. This is not to say every husband who received such a letter read it with satisfaction. Some, by the private accounts that survive in diaries and later reminiscences, felt genuine unease at how easily the decision had been made, how little their wife's own voice had featured in it. A few wrote back to physicians asking whether the treatment was truly necessary, whether a shorter stay might suffice, whether their wife might be consulted more directly about her own preferences. But the machinery of the diagnosis, once set in motion, was not built to reverse itself easily. To question the physician's judgment was, in the medical culture of the era, close to questioning the physician's competence, and few husbands of the social standing this story concerns wish to be seen doing that. There is also the matter of what the physician gained from the arrangement, because physicians of this era were not disinterested parties either. A wealthy patient sent abroad for an extended cure was a wealthy patient whose consultations, letters, and eventual follow-up visits generated fees for a period of months rather than a single afternoon. The spa towns themselves employed resident physicians who examined new arrivals, prescribed a regimen of baths and waters, and billed accordingly an entire secondary economy built around the ongoing renewable diagnosis of women who had, in most cases, simply grown tired of being unheard. None of this means the tiredness was invented. This is the part of the story that resists a simple villain. Many of these women were, by any honest measure, exhausted. Running a household of the size and complexity common to the period was a genuine labour, unpaid and largely unacknowledged, performed on top of the emotional labour of a marriage that frequently offered little companionship in return. The exhaustion was real. What was manufactured, or at least selectively directed, was the explanation for it, and the remedy assigned to address an explanation that conveniently avoided any examination of the marriage itself. A different remedy was available in theory. A husband who noticed his wife's exhaustion could have altered his own behaviour, could have taken on more of the household's decisions, could have simply asked her directly what she needed. This remedy appears remarkably rarely in the record, not because it never occurred to anyone, but because it required an admission that the marriage itself might be the source of the strain, and that admission was, for most men of this class and period, considerably harder to make than the cost of a transatlantic ticket. It is worth imagining the letter once more, sitting on a desk in a study with the door closed, waiting to be sent. The handwriting is careful, the tone is measured, the diagnosis is offered with genuine medical confidence. And somewhere upstairs, unaware that her next several months have just been decided, a woman is doing precisely the thing the letter describes as her symptom, She is tired. She's been tired for a long time, and no one, in the entire careful correspondence that will determine her autumn, has yet thought to ask her why. The letter is sealed, eventually. It is carried by hand to the post, or perhaps delivered directly between two studies in two houses not far apart. And the woman it concerns continues, for a few more days, to run the household she does not yet know she's about to leave, moving through rooms that are, without her realizing it, already being measured for her absence. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a house once a decision like this has been made but not yet spoken aloud. The servants sometimes know before the wife does. A change in the pattern of who is called to which study. A trunk quietly requested from storage. The house holds the secret the way houses hold secrets, in its floorboards and its silences, until the morning arrives when the secret becomes an announcement, delivered gently, over breakfast, already final. The physicians who corresponded most frequently with each other about cases like yours often knew one another from medical school or from shared membership in the same professional societies, a small, tightly networked world in which reputation travelled quickly and consensus formed easily. If one respected colleague had successfully treated a dozen wealthy wives with the standard prescription of rest and continental waters, the next physician facing a similar case had little professional incentive to deviate from an approach that had, by every measure the profession recognised, already proven itself. Medicine of this era moved by consensus and precedent nearly as much as it moved by individual examination, and a diagnosis that had worked, or appeared to work, for one patient became the template applied, with only minor variation, to the next. There is a particular kind of letter, preserved in a handful of medical archives, written by a physician to a colleague requesting a second opinion on a case very much like yours. These letters, when they survive, are strikingly formal, almost clinical in their brevity, describing the patient's symptoms in a paragraph or two, before moving quickly to the practical matter of recommended treatment. Rarely do these letters include any extended account of the patient's own words, her own description of what she was experiencing. The exclusion was not necessarily deliberate. It simply reflected an assumption, embedded so deeply in the medical culture of the period that it required no justification, that the patient's own account was secondary to the husband's observation and the physician's professional judgment. You might wonder, lying in your berth tonight, whether things could have unfolded differently if you had been present in that first consultation, if your own voice had been heard directly rather than filtered through your husband's account of you. It is a fair question, and the honest answer is that it might have changed very little. The diagnostic categories available to the physicians of this era were themselves limited, built around assumptions about female nervous fragility that would have shaped their interpretation of your own words nearly as thoroughly as they shaped their interpretation of your husband's description. Even a woman who spoke plainly and confidently about her own exhaustion risked having that very plainness read as further evidence of nervous strain, a bind so complete that very few women of this period found any way out of it through direct advocacy alone. This does not mean the arrangement was inevitable or that no woman ever resisted it. Some did, quietly, through means available to them within the narrow constraints of their circumstances. A wife might delay her departure through a series of small, plausible postponements, a child's minor illness requiring her presence a little longer, a household matter that seemed, conveniently, to require her personal attention just as the trunks were meant to be packed. These small acts of resistance rarely reversed the underlying decision, but they occasionally bought time, weeks or months during which circumstances might shift. A husband's attention might turn elsewhere. The original urgency behind the diagnosis might quietly fade. Other women resisted more directly, refusing outright, and the historical record includes scattered examples of exactly this kind of refusal. Wives who simply declined to board the ship their husbands had arranged, who insisted on their own account of their health and their own preferences for how to address it. These refusals carried real risk, since a husband who felt his judgment openly defied might respond with consequences considerably harsher than an unwanted ocean voyage, but they existed, evidence that even within a system built to exclude a wife's own voice from decisions about her own body, some women found ways to insert that voice regardless. The insurance and financial arrangements surrounding an extended rescue also shaped, in ways rarely discussed openly, exactly how these decisions unfolded. A husband committing to months of hotel bills, physician's fees, and travel costs was making a financial decision as much as a medical one, and household account books from the period where they survive show these expenses recorded alongside the household's other major expenditures, treated with the same careful accounting as a new carriage or a season of entertaining, a detail that reveals something about how thoroughly the rescue had become simply another line item in the management of a wealthy household's annual affairs. Some households negotiated the length and expense of the treatment with a degree of practicality that sits uneasily alongside the tender medical language used to describe it. A physician's initial recommendation of 6 months might be quietly reduced to 4 in the ensuing correspondence between husband and doctor, not because her condition had been reassessed, but because a business venture required capital that had been earmarked for her continued care abroad. The wife herself, in these negotiations, remained almost entirely absent from the conversation, her treatment's duration determined by financial calculations she was never invited to review. There is a poignant category of correspondence, preserved in a handful of family archives, in which a wife, writing home partway through her prescribed treatment, gently inquired about the household's finances, offering, almost apologetically, to shorten her own stay if the expense had become burdensome. These letters reveal a particular and painful irony. A woman sent away for her own well-being, nonetheless anxious about the cost of that well-being, to a household she no longer had any direct hand in managing, her concern for the family's finances persisting even after her formal authority over those finances had been entirely suspended. One more detail deserves mention before this particular thread closes: the role of the extended family in either reinforcing or occasionally quietly complicating the decision once it had been made. A mother-in-law or a sister sometimes served as a kind of secondary authority in these arrangements, consulted by the husband, sometimes more trusted in her assessment of the wife's condition than the wife's own account of herself, adding yet another voice to the chorus of people speaking about her rather than with her in these crucial early days. Consider, finally, the strange asymmetry embedded in whose testimony carried weight in these consultations. A husband's account of his wife's exhaustion, offered second-hand and filtered through his own frustrations and preferences, was treated as reliable clinical evidence. A wife's own account of her exhaustion, had she been given the chance to offer it directly and at length, would very likely have been read within the medical assumptions of the era, as further evidence of the very nervous instability the diagnosis presumed, her own words used against her own credibility in a closed loop that offered no genuine exit. This is perhaps the clearest evidence available that the arrangement was never truly designed to discover the truth of her condition. It was designed to produce a decision efficiently, with the smallest possible disruption to the household's existing order, and in that narrow, specific sense, it succeeded admirably, whatever it cost the woman at its centre. It is worth sitting one last time with the specific silence that surrounded this entire process, a silence maintained not through any single act of suppression, but through the accumulated weight of 100 small social conventions, each one individually reasonable, that together ensured a wife's own account of her situation rarely reached the people making decisions about it. The silence was not conspiracy. It was structure, built brick by brick over generations until it no longer required any single person's active intention to keep standing. It is worth adding one further dimension to this account: the role that time itself played in cementing a decision that might, in a different circumstance, have remained open to reconsideration. Once the physician's letter had been written, once the steamship tickets had been purchased, once word had begun, inevitably, to circulate among the family's social circle that a departure was planned, the decision acquired a momentum that became increasingly difficult to reverse, regardless of any second thoughts that might have arisen in the intervening days. A husband who privately wondered, a week before the sailing date, whether the whole arrangement had moved too quickly, faced not only his own uncertainty, but the accumulated social weight of a plan already set in motion, invitations already declined on his wife's behalf, a physician already credited with a diagnosis that would now require some explanation if abandoned. The machinery, once started, generated its own reasons to continue, quite apart from whatever reasons had started it. And so the decision, once fully assembled from physician's letter and husband's account and the quiet momentum of social expectation, arrived at your breakfast table not as a proposal open for discussion, but as an outcome already settled, delivered with the particular gentleness reserved for news that everyone involved has agreed, in advance not to examine too closely. You will carry this letter's shape with you now, unopened and unnamed, into whatever waters wait ahead, a shape you did not choose but that has already, quietly, begun to choose the next several months of your life on your behalf. The room where the letter was written has long since gone quiet, its desk cleared, its sherry glasses put away, but the shape of what was decided there still travels with you, patiently, across the water. She would carry this quiet knowledge with her onto the ship, the awareness of exactly how the decision had been reached without her, and it would sit alongside her, unspoken, through every mile of the crossing ahead. It would take her months and considerable distance to fully understand exactly how much had been decided in that quiet room before she'd ever been consulted at all. Let this settle now the way it settled then, slowly, without drama, a decision arriving from a room you were never invited into, carried across an ocean by the same tide that carries you now. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. A woman of your circumstance did not pack her own trunks. This was true even in ordinary travel, and it was especially true in a departure arranged as swiftly and as thoroughly as this one, where a lady's maid and sometimes a second hired packer moved through the bedroom for 2 full days before the carriage arrived, folding, layering, wrapping each item in tissue with the seriousness of someone assembling an inventory rather than a wardrobe. The steamer trunk itself, standing upright with its brass fittings, was a small architecture. Drawers on one side for undergarments and linens, a hanging section on the other for gowns kept from crushing, a hidden compartment at the base for the items a woman might not wish a customs officer to examine too closely, letters, a small amount of private money, a photograph or two. The trunk was designed by the manufacturers who advertised it in the same magazines that ran advertisements for rest cures and nerve tonics to contain an entire season of a woman's life inside a box that could be carried by 2 strong men. The gowns packed first were the ones considered appropriate for travel and for the first weeks of arrival, dark wools and sturdy silks in the deep, forgiving colours that suggested seriousness rather than display. A woman departing for a rest cure was not meant to arrive looking festive. The clothes she wore in these early weeks were meant to perform their own kind of diagnosis. Quiet, subdued, convalescent, so that anyone observing her disembark from the ship would read her correctly before she said a single word. Beneath the gowns went the smaller, stranger items that made up the material culture of a Gilded Age illness. Bottles of tonic procured before departure on the advice of the family physician, dark glass containers with handwritten labels promising to fortify the nerves, a hot water bottle wrapped carefully in flannel, smelling salts in case the crossing proved rough, a small pharmacy's worth of preparations for headache, for insomnia, for the various symptoms that had justified the trip in the first place, packed by a maid who had likely never been consulted about whether any of them actually helped. There were books, though fewer than a woman might have wished, because reading itself was sometimes considered a strain on the nerves rather than a relief from them, and physicians occasionally recommended limiting a patient's intellectual activity as part of the cure, a volume of scripture almost always, a book of devotional readings. Perhaps if her husband or her physician had not been especially strict about it, a novel, tucked beneath something else, packed by a maid who understood without being told that certain items travelled better when they were not itemised aloud. Letters of introduction went into a smaller case that would stay with her rather than travel in the hold. Letters addressed to the physicians she would see abroad, to the proprietors of the hotels that specialised in exactly this kind of guest, occasionally to distant relations or family friends living in Europe who might be persuaded to call on her, to ensure that even in her removal from the household she remained, in some sense, accounted for and observed. And there was jewellery, though carefully selected, because a woman travelling for her health did not wear the full weight of her usual ornamentation. A modest brooch, a wedding ring, of course, worn as much as a form of identification as a symbol of affection, since a woman travelling without her husband in this period needed the ring's visible authority to move through hotels and dining rooms without being questioned. What did not go into the trunks is its own kind of record. Very little that belonged to her independent of the household, because in the strictest legal sense, in most of the states this story concerns, very little did. The furniture in her bedroom, the very bed she had slept in for 2 decades, belonged to her husband. The household accounts she had managed belonged, on paper, to him as well. Her labour in balancing them unrecorded and uncompensated in any ledger that mattered legally. She was, in the eyes of the law that would govern her marriage for most of this period, packing herself away from a house that had never, in any binding sense, been hers to begin with. There is a particular kind of grief embedded in packing for a departure you did not choose, a grief the trunks themselves seem to hold even now, in the museum collections where a few of them survive, brass corners dulled, leather cracked, the tissue paper long gone but the shape of what it once protected still faintly visible in the wear patterns along the drawers. Someone folded these things with care. Someone closed these latches believing, or trying to believe, that what waited on the other side of the ocean was rest rather than removal. The children's portraits, when they were included at all, travelled in the smaller case, wrapped in a handkerchief tucked beside the letters of introduction. A mother departing for a rest cure of indeterminate length did not always bring a large likeness of her children, because a large likeness invited a grief that was considered, by the medical thinking of the era, counterproductive to recovery. A small photograph, glanced at privately in the evening, was permitted. A framed portrait on the nightstand inviting daily contemplation of everyone she had left behind was not encouraged. The lady's maid who packed these trunks understood, in the quiet way servants understood most things in these households, exactly what kind of departure this was. She had likely overheard the conversation at breakfast, or the earlier conversation in the study filtered second-hand through the housekeeper or the butler, and she folded each item with the specific tenderness of someone preparing another person for a difficulty that person did not yet fully understand herself. By the second evening the trunk stood closed and labelled in the front hall, waiting for the carriage that would come in the morning. The house around them had already begun, in small ways, to rearrange itself. A room down the corridor, unused for years, had been opened and aired. A conversation between the housekeeper and a woman none of the children recognised had taken place in the front parlour, brief and businesslike, the kind of conversation that precedes a change no one has yet been told is coming. None of this appeared on any label. The trunk said only her name, her destination, the name of the steamship line. They did not say what she was leaving, or what would be different when, if, she returned to find where each item had come from. They were simply luggage, brass and leather and canvas, carrying a woman's clothes and medicines and a handful of small mercies across an ocean, toward a place that had been chosen for her, for reasons that were only partly about her health. There was, in the better households, an entire secondary industry built around outfitting a woman for exactly this kind of extended absence. Dressmakers who specialised in what the trade papers of the period called invalid dress, garments designed to look presentable in a hotel dining room while accommodating the loosened stays and softened silhouettes that a rest cure was believed to require. A woman's usual corseting, tightly structured for the demands of ordinary social display, was often relaxed for the duration of her treatment, on the theory that the body, like the nerves, needed room to recover rather than remain bound into its habitual shape. The maid who packed for you would have consulted, in the days before departure, a checklist passed down through the household's practice, itself likely inherited from an earlier lady's maid who had packed for an earlier mistress under similar circumstances. These checklists, when they survive in household record books, reveal an entire choreography of preparation, undergarments counted and recounted, travelling cases fitted with exactly the right complement of brushes and combs and small glass jars, everything arranged with a precision that suggests genuine care even within an arrangement that had, at its root, very little to do with what the travelling woman herself actually wanted. Shoes required particular attention, since the walking regimen prescribed at nearly every spa town demanded footwear sturdier than the delicate slippers appropriate for an evening at home. Several pairs went into the trunk, chosen for durability over fashion, a small but telling detail that distinguished this kind of packing from the packing that preceded a purely social journey. This was, whatever else it was, preparation for genuine physical activity, walking measured in miles rather than the short distances between a carriage and a drawing-room door. The correspondence materials packed alongside the letters of introduction deserve their own mention, because a woman embarking on a rescue was expected to maintain regular contact with home, and the tools for doing so, quality writing paper, sealing wax, a small travelling writing desk that could be set up on a hotel room table, were packed with the same care as the medical preparations. The physical act of writing itself was sometimes recommended by physicians as a mild, appropriate activity for a resting patient. Gentle enough not to strain the nerves further, purposeful enough to prevent the idle hours from tipping into a different kind of distress. It is worth imagining one more time the specific weight of that closed trunk, as it was carried down the stairs by two men from the household staff, its brass corners catching the early light, its contents representing months of a life compressed into a space no larger than a modest writing desk. Everything a woman might need for an uncertain length of time in an unfamiliar country had to fit within those dimensions, a physical constraint that mirrored, in its own way, the larger constraint governing the entire journey, a life reduced to what could be carried, chosen, and controlled by people other than the woman who would actually have to live inside it. Among the smaller items tucked into the corners of the trunk were the tokens of home that a woman was permitted, and sometimes encouraged, to bring with her: a favourite shawl worn soft with years of use, a small clock that had sat on her own nightstand for as long as she could remember, its familiar tick a portable piece of the bedroom she was leaving behind. These objects carried a significance that no inventory list could capture. Small anchors of continuity packed alongside the tonics and the travelling costume, chosen not by the maid's practical checklist but by the traveller's own quiet, private selection of what she could not bear to leave entirely behind. The trunk's manufacturer, in the better examples that survive in museum collections today, had often stamped a small brass plate near the lock bearing the family's initials or crest, a detail that meant this particular trunk, however temporarily it held a woman's uncertain future, would return eventually to the same household, cycling through other departures, other journeys, carrying other family members on other crossings across the decades that followed. The trunk, in this sense, outlasted the specific circumstance that had prompted this particular packing, a piece of the household's material history that would continue its service long after the rest cure it now enabled had faded into memory. It is worth considering, too, the particular labour the packing maid performed in these final days, labour that has left almost no trace in any historical record beyond the faint inference of a well-organised trunk. She would have worked long hours, coordinating with the household's other staff, checking items off her list by lamplight after the rest of the house had gone quiet, performing this careful, invisible service for a mistress who may never have thought to thank her directly for it, because such thanks, within the rigid etiquette of these households, rarely crossed the boundary between employer and servant, even in moments as significant as this one. One last item belongs in this account of the trunks, the small sewing kit nearly every woman of this era carried regardless of her destination, needles and thread, and a pair of small scissors folded into a leather case no larger than a hand. It was practical, certainly, useful for the inevitable small repairs of long travel, but it also represented something else, a last quiet continuity with the domestic competence that had defined her entire adult life, a skill that required no permission and no physician's authorization, carried across the ocean simply because her hands had known how to use it for as long as she could remember. Consider, too, the particular weight of the medical supplies that occupied so much space within the trunk's careful arrangement. An entire small pharmacy assembled, not because any single physician had determined its exact contents necessary, but because the general anxious uncertainty surrounding a rescue of unknown duration encouraged a kind of defensive overpacking, every conceivable remedy included on the theory that it was better to carry too much than to arrive somewhere unfamiliar and find herself lacking. This impulse, understandable enough given the genuine uncertainty of what awaited her, meant that the trunk itself became a physical manifestation of the anxiety underlying the entire journey, its careful, orderly rows of bottles and tonics standing in for a peace of mind that packing alone could never actually provide. As the trunk's lid was finally closed and its brass latches pressed shut, the room around it fell briefly quiet, the maid stepping back to survey her work with the particular satisfaction of a task completed thoroughly and well, unaware, or perhaps simply unable to say aloud, that she had just packed away considerably more than clothing and tonics. She had packed the last visible traces of a woman's ordinary domestic authority, folded neatly into drawers that would not be opened again until a hotel room on the other side of an ocean required their contents. There is one more layer to this account of packing worth, including, before the trunk closes for good, the quiet negotiation that sometimes occurred between a wife and her lady's maid over items the physician's list had not specifically authorised, but that the wife requested anyway: a particular shawl not on any inventory, a small stack of writing paper beyond what seemed strictly necessary, a second pair of gloves in a colour that served no practical purpose beyond simply being one she liked. These small additions, negotiated quietly and without any formal permission sought from husband or physician, represent perhaps the first small assertions of independent preference this entire process had permitted her, tiny and easily overlooked but genuine, evidence that even within an arrangement built almost entirely around other people's decisions, some sliver of her own will still find room to express itself, however modestly, in the choosing of what finally went into the trunk. And so the trunk stood ready by morning, a small contained architecture holding everything the household had decided she might need, waiting only for the carriage that would carry it and her toward a dock and a ship and a version of her life that no one, not the maid who packed it, nor the woman who would live out of it, could yet fully picture. Somewhere in the folds of that closed trunk, unlabelled and unremarked, travelled the last physical trace of the household authority she had spent 2 decades quietly building. Packed away now alongside the tonics and the sturdy shoes, waiting for a hotel room on the far side of an ocean to be opened again. Whatever the trunk could not hold, whatever it was never designed to carry, would have to be gathered some other way, in some other season, by the woman who would eventually open it again. The house itself, watching from its windows, seemed almost to hold its breath as the trunk was carried down the front steps and loaded onto the waiting carriage, one more small departure in a house that had, over the years, seen a great many comings and goings, though rarely one quite like this. Let the sound of the trunk's latches be the last sound of the house you are leaving. Let everything after this be only the sea. The great liners of the period, the ones that carried wealthy Americans back and forth across the Atlantic with the regularity of a ferry crossing a smaller and gentler body of water, were built to feel less like ships than like floating extensions of the drawing rooms their passengers had left behind. Mahogany panelling, electric lighting, still novel enough in these years to be remarked upon in letters home. Dining saloons with ceilings high enough to hold a chandelier, and stewards trained to remember, by the second day out, exactly how each first-class passenger preferred her tea. For a woman travelling for her nerves, the crossing itself was often the first genuinely restful stretch of time she had experienced in years, whatever the circumstances that had placed her aboard. There was, for perhaps the only time in her adult life, nothing that required her direct management. No household staff awaiting instruction, no dinner menu to approve, no child requiring attention at an hour that did not belong to her. The days on a transatlantic crossing, 6 or 7 of them depending on the ship and the weather, unfolded according to a rhythm entirely outside her control, and for a woman who had spent 2 decades controlling everything, that loss of control arrived, unexpectedly, as a kind of relief. Mornings began late, later than any morning she'd permitted herself at home. A steward would knock softly with tea and a small selection of dry toast, understanding, as the stewards on these routes generally did, that women travelling under a physician's recommendation for rest were not to be rushed into the day. She might not rise until 9, might not dress until 10, and no one aboard the ship would think this remarkable, because half the women in first class were travelling under some version of the same quiet instruction. The promenade deck, when the weather allowed it, became a kind of slow processional. Women in long coats walked its length in pairs or alone, wrapped against the wind, pausing at the railing to watch the water for stretches of time that would have seemed, at home, indulgently long. There was no equivalent activity in the world she had left. A woman did not simply stand at a window for 20 minutes watching the light change on a lawn. But here, on a ship, in the specific suspended time of a crossing, that kind of stillness was not only permitted but expected. She would have met other women during these days because the passenger manifests of these ships, when the season was right, carried a recognisable population travelling for reasons very close to her own. A widow going to visit a married daughter in Paris, a young woman with a chaperone being taken to complete her education, or more accurately to be introduced to the marriage market of the European aristocracy. And, more often than the shipping company's brochures ever advertised, women exactly like her travelling alone or with a hired companion, whose reason for the voyage, when it came up at all, was offered in the same 3 careful words: for my health. Conversation among these women had its own particular etiquette, a way of circling the truth without naming it directly. No one asked outright what illness required a crossing of this length and this expense. The question, when it was asked at all, was gentler and more oblique. Are you travelling for a rest? And the answer nearly always was yes, delivered with a small private smile that acknowledged, without saying so, that the word rest was doing a great deal of work it had not been designed to do. The dining saloon in the evenings offered its own theatre. A woman travelling under a doctor's recommendation for nervous exhaustion was, paradoxically, expected to appear at dinner in reasonably good spirits, dressed appropriately, conversant, because a public collapse into visible unhappiness aboard a first-class liner would have violated the same social code that had sent her abroad in the first place. She dressed. She came down. She spoke pleasantly with the captain's table or with whichever acquaintance she had made that afternoon on the promenade deck, and if anyone at that table had asked her directly how she truly felt, she likely would not have known how to begin answering honestly, not because she lacked the words, but because no one in her life had asked her that particular question in longer than she could easily recall. There were storms on some crossings, and the ship's structure that had seemed so solid, so much like a hotel that happened to be floating, would reveal itself briefly as exactly what it was, a vessel of iron and rivets moving through open ocean, at the mercy of weather no engineering could fully tame. During these hours, the passengers who had spent the calm days performing composure often let something truer show. Fear, certainly, but also, in some accounts left behind in diaries and letters, a strange exhilaration, the sense of being somewhere the ordinary rules of her life could not follow her, not even the rule that required her to remain composed. By the fourth or fifth day, the rhythm of the ship had fully absorbed her. Meals, walks, the slow accumulation of acquaintance among the other passengers, an afternoon spent with a book she had been permitted to bring, an hour in the ship's small library, a nap taken without guilt in the middle of the afternoon because there was, for the first time in years, nothing waiting to be neglected by her absence. It is worth sitting with how radical this must have felt, even amid the grief of what had prompted it. A rest, however involuntarily arrived at, is still a rest. Letters were written during these days, though they would not be posted until the ship made landfall, letters to the children, careful and reassuring, describing the ship's comforts and the calm weather, and promising to write again soon from wherever the journey next took her. She likely did not write in these letters about the particular quality of the silence in her stateroom at night, the strange lightness of days that belonged to no one but her, because there was no vocabulary in her world for describing relief that arrived wrapped in loss. On the final evening before landfall, the ship's orchestra, if it carried one, would play in the main saloon, and the passengers would gather for a farewell dinner marking the end of the crossing, the beginning of whatever waited on the other side. She would have dressed carefully for this one, the last evening of a suspended time she had not asked for but had, by the sixth day, come quietly to value. Tomorrow there would be customs officials and porters and a hired companion waiting at the dock with the itinerary already arranged by people she had never met. Tonight there was only the orchestra and the dark water outside the windows, and a version of herself that existed briefly between the life she had left and the one that was waiting. The ship's library, modest as it usually was compared to the grand public rooms, offered its own quiet refuge for passengers who preferred solitude to the promenade deck's slow social choreography. A handful of shelves stocked with novels and travel accounts and the occasional volume of poetry, tended by a steward who kept a simple ledger of what had been borrowed and by whom. For a woman accustomed to having her reading, like everything else, gently monitored for its appropriateness to her condition, the library's relative privacy offered a small, welcome exception. An hour spent choosing a book for no reason beyond her own curiosity. Meals aboard these liners followed an elaborate schedule of their own, breakfast served over several hours to accommodate the varied waking times of first-class passengers, luncheon at midday, afternoon tea appearing punctually at 4 with its own small ceremony of sandwiches and cakes, and dinner in the evening as the day's central social event. The sheer abundance of food available at every hour struck many first-time transatlantic travellers as remarkable. An entire ship apparently organised around the continuous, generous feeding of its passengers, in stark contrast to the more careful, purposeful household management most of these women had practised for decades at home. Weather permitting, deck games offered another mild diversion. Quoits and shuffleboard played by passengers bundled against the wind, a gentle competitive pastime that asked nothing more strenuous than an occasional toss and a pleasant exchange of scores. These games drew a mixed crowd, families travelling together, young couples, and, among them, the particular population of resting women this story follows, participating at whatever level their prescribed regimen allowed, sometimes merely watching from a deck chair wrapped in blankets, content to observe rather than join. The stewardesses aboard these ships, women hired specifically to attend to the needs of female passengers travelling in first class, developed over years of this work a practiced sensitivity to exactly which passengers required extra attention and which preferred to be left alone. A skilled stewardess could read, within the first day of a crossing, which of her charges was travelling for genuine pleasure and which was travelling under circumstances considerably more complicated, adjusting her own manner accordingly, offering company to a passenger who seemed to want it, and a respectful, attentive distance to one who did not. By the middle days of the crossing, a kind of temporary community had generally formed among the regular passengers of first class, small groups gathering at the same tables, the same deck chairs, the same hour for tea, a society that existed for exactly the length of the voyage, and would dissolve entirely upon arrival, its members scattering to their separate destinations without any expectation of meeting again. And yet within that brief, contained society, real intimacy sometimes formed, confidences exchanged between strangers who understood correctly that whatever was said aboard ship carried no consequence once the gangway was lowered, and everyone returned to their separate permanent lives on land. The engineering of these great liners, remarkable for its era, produced its own particular sensory environment that shaped the whole experience of the crossing. The steady vibration of the engines felt through the floor of every cabin and every public room became within a day or two a background presence so constant that passengers stopped noticing it consciously, the way a person stops noticing the sound of their own household after enough years of living inside it. This constant low thrum, oddly, proved soothing to many passengers, a mechanical heartbeat that some later described in their letters as more restful than the ordinary silence of a house on land, precisely because it required no interpretation, no listening for the specific meaning behind a footstep or a closing door. Nighttime aboard ship carried its own particular quality, the public rooms emptying gradually as passengers retired, the corridors quieting until only the occasional steward's footstep and the ever-present engine hum remained. A woman lying awake in her berth during these hours, unable to sleep despite the day's careful rest, might find herself, for the first time in a very long while, entirely alone with her own thoughts, unaccompanied by any household obligation waiting to interrupt them, the darkness outside the porthole offering nothing to look at, and in its emptiness, nothing demanding to be managed or attended to. Some crossings brought fog, a particular hazard of the North Atlantic route that required the ship to slow its pace and sound its horn at intervals through the grey, muffled hours, a sound that travelled through the whole vessel and reached even the most sheltered cabin. Passengers who experienced this found the foghorns low, repeated call unexpectedly affecting, a sound that seemed to voice, better than any words could have, the particular blend of caution and forward movement that defined this entire crossing, this entire chapter of a life being lived, quite literally, in a fog of uncertain purpose and uncertain destination. One further detail rounds out this account of the crossing, the small rituals of arrival that began even before the ship reached port, trunks brought up from the hold a day early, passports and papers gathered and checked, a final quiet dinner aboard ship that carried for many of these women a faint and unexpected sadness, the recognition that this brief suspended interval of belonging to no one's schedule but her own was, in a matter of hours, about to end. Consider, too, how the ship's own social hierarchy, invisible in its details but rigid in its effect, shaped who a woman might reasonably speak with during these days at sea. First-class passengers rarely encountered those travelling in second-class or steerage, the vessel's architecture itself enforcing a separation as complete, in its way, as the separation between drawing rooms and servants' quarters back home. Within her own class, however, the ship's confined and temporary society permitted a looseness of acquaintance that would have seemed remarkable on land, strangers becoming confidants within days, simply because the shared circumstance of the crossing collapsed the usual, careful gradations of introduction and social vetting that governed acquaintance in the more permanent society she had left behind. As the days accumulated into a full week at sea, she would have noticed her own body beginning to settle into an unfamiliar looseness. Shoulders that had carried tension for so long she no longer consciously registered it, beginning, slowly, to unclench, a physical relaxation that arrived not through any single dramatic moment, but through the patient cumulative effect of days spent with nothing urgent left to carry. There is one further texture of the crossing worth adding here, the particular quality of conversation that developed among women who understood, without needing the fact stated outright, that whatever was said within the confines of the ship carried no obligation to be remembered or repeated once the voyage ended. This temporary confidentiality, built into the very structure of a crossing that would scatter its passengers permanently in a matter of days, produced a kind of honesty rare in the more permanent social circles these women inhabited at home, where every word spoken carried the weight of a reputation that would need to be maintained for years afterward. Aboard ship, for this brief window, a woman could say something true about her marriage, her exhaustion, her private hopes for what these coming months abroad might actually offer her, and trust that the words would travel no further than the person sitting across the small table from her, herself bound for an entirely different destination and an entirely separate life. And so the days at sea passed, one into the next, each one asking slightly less of her than the day before, until by the crossing's final stretch she had arrived, without quite noticing the transition, at a version of rest that no household back home had ever once permitted her to reach. Somewhere below deck, in the quiet hum of the engines, a version of rest was already beginning to take hold of her, unhurried and unfamiliar, gathering itself slowly across the long dark hours between one shore and the next. Whatever waited on the other shore tonight belonged entirely to the water, wide and dark and patient, asking nothing of her but to let it carry her forward. By the final night, the ship's orchestra played its farewell, and she sat listening, dressed carefully, aware that whatever waited beyond tomorrow's landfall, tonight belonged still, briefly, entirely to her. Tomorrow would bring customs officials and porters, and an itinerary arranged by strangers. Tonight belonged only to the orchestra, the dark water, and the last few hours of a self that answered to no one. Let the ship's motion carry you the way it carried her, forward through dark water toward a shore she could not yet see, unhurried, unaccountable to anyone for just these few more hours. Baden-Baden, in the last decades of the 19th century, was a town that had built its entire architecture around the idea of the cure. It sat in a green fold of the Black Forest, its streets arranged around the old Roman baths that had drawn visitors to these particular springs for nearly 2,000 years, long before any American physician had invented the word neurasthenia to describe what a wealthy woman's exhaustion required. The town knew, in its bones, in the very layout of its colonnades and promenades, exactly how to receive a person who had arrived to be healed. The Trinkhalle, the pump room where visitors drank the mineral waters believed to restore health, stretched along one edge of the town in a long colonnaded building painted with murals of local legend, its interior smelling faintly of sulphur and warm stone. A woman newly arrived would be brought here on her first or second morning, handed a small glass by an attendant who had performed this exact gesture for thousands of visitors before her, and instructed to drink slowly the water drawn from springs that emerged from the ground already warm. The taste, by every account left behind, was not pleasant. Mineral, faintly metallic, warmer than a beverage had any right to be. But the ritual of drinking it, morning after morning, at the hour the resident physician prescribed, became its own kind of medicine regardless of what the water itself actually contained. There was comfort in the structure of it, comfort in being told, clearly and specifically, what to do with each hour of the morning, after so many years of being the one who told everyone else. The baths themselves, in the grand bathhouses built specifically for this purpose, offered an experience closer to ceremony than to bathing, as she would have understood it at home. Marble rooms heated by the same thermal springs that fed the Trinkhalle, arranged in sequence, a warm room, a hotter room, a cooling room, an attendant guiding each visitor through the progression, with the calm authority of someone who had guided 1,000 tired bodies through exactly this sequence before. She would emerge after an hour or more into a resting room where she was wrapped in warmed linens and left to lie in a kind of supervised stillness that had no equivalent anywhere in the household she had left behind. It is worth pausing on how strange and how welcome this must have felt. At home, stillness was rarely permitted to a woman of her position, and when it occurred as a private, almost illicit pause snatched between obligations, 5 minutes in a locked bedroom before a child or a servant knocked with a question that could not wait. Here, in the resting room of a German bathhouse, stillness was not only permitted but prescribed. An attendant would gently correct her if she attempted to rise too soon. The rest itself had become, however oddly, an assignment she was finally allowed to complete without interruption. The physicians who practiced in Baden-Baden were accustomed to precisely this category of patient, and they had developed, over decades of treating wealthy foreign visitors, a particular bedside manner suited to it. Gentle, unhurried, willing to spend 40 minutes on a consultation that a busy American physician might have compressed into 10. They asked questions her husband's physician back home had never thought to ask. How did she sleep? What troubled her specifically when she lay awake? Whether there was anything at all, weighing on her mind that she had not yet spoken aloud to anyone. Some of these physicians, it is worth noting, appear in the letters and diaries of the period as genuinely perceptive men, willing to look past the fashionable diagnosis to something closer to the truth, even if the medical language available to them still fell short of naming it precisely. A few recorded in their private casebooks observations that read almost as social commentary. This patient's fatigue appears connected less to any organic weakness than to a prolonged absence of any activity she considers her own. Words like these rarely made their way into the letters sent back to the husband who was paying the bill. The town itself, beyond the baths, offered its own gentle rhythm. A promenade along the Lichtenthaler Allee, a mile and a half of tree-lined path following the small river through the valley, walked slowly, by prescription, every afternoon regardless of weather, unless the weather was severe. A concert in the evening, performed by an orchestra that played for the town's visitors nightly during the season, music chosen deliberately for its calming rather than its stirring qualities. A casino, elegant and restrained by the standards of later gambling halls, where some of the wealthier visitors passed an hour or two, though a woman travelling for her nerves was generally advised against too much excitement even here. What Baden-Baden offered, more than any specific mineral property in its waters, was permission. Permission to move slowly. Permission to be tired without needing to justify the tiredness to anyone. Permission to spend an entire day accomplishing nothing more than a walk, a bath, a meal, a rest, without a single person suggesting that this was insufficient, indulgent, or strange. For women who had spent decades being told, implicitly and explicitly, that their worth was measured by what they accomplished on behalf of other people, this permission arrived like a foreign language finally being spoken in a voice they could understand. There were, of course, other Americans in the town, and word travelled quickly within that small transplanted society about who had arrived and under what circumstances. A woman new to Baden-Baden would be identified within days, her husband's name and fortune quietly established through the hotel registers and the shared acquaintances that connected wealthy American families across an ocean. But the identification, in this particular town, at this particular kind of establishment, did not come with the scrutiny it might have carried at home. Everyone here was, in one way or another, resting. No one asked too closely why. In the evenings, after the concert, after dinner in the hotel dining room, she would return to a suite that was, in its own way, larger and quieter than any room she had occupied at home. Because at home a room was never entirely her own, always subject to the household's needs, a child's interruption, a servant's question. Here, for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, a closed door meant a closed door. No one on the other side of it required anything from her until morning. This, more than any particular property of the waters, may have been the actual cure Baden-Baden offered, though it was never written into any physician's prescription. Not the sulphur, not the warm marble rooms, not the careful walking regimen along the river. Simply the extended, uninterrupted experience of being left alone, in a place where being left alone was not a failure of duty but the entire point of the visit. The town's hotels had developed their own careful ecosystem around the needs of exactly this category of guest, staff trained to anticipate a patient's schedule without requiring her to ask, breakfast trays that arrived precisely when the physician's regimen called for them, rooms kept quiet during the hours designated for rest, an entire hospitality apparatus organised around the specific rhythms of recovery rather than the ordinary demands of tourism. This was, in its way, a considerable luxury, the experience of an entire small industry oriented around anticipating her needs rather than the reverse, a stark contrast to a household in which she had spent decades anticipating everyone else's needs before her own. The gardens surrounding many of these hotels were themselves designed with the cure in mind, planted with the kind of gentle, undemanding beauty that a physician might have prescribed alongside the waters, winding paths shaded by mature trees, benches placed at intervals calculated to allow a tired walker frequent unremarked pauses. A woman could spend an entire morning moving slowly through these grounds, sitting when she wished, rising when she wished, observed by no one whose opinion of her pace or her stamina carried any consequence at all. Music, beyond the formal evening concerts, threaded through the town's daily rhythm in smaller ways as well. A string quartet occasionally rehearsing in a pavilion, a lone violinist practicing scales audible through an open window, the ordinary background texture of a town that had organised its entire economy around the pleasant, unhurried recovery of its visitors. This ambient music, unlike the demanding social performances of dinner parties back home, asked nothing of its listeners beyond the simple willingness to hear it. For a woman raised within the strict social calendar of American high society, where every gathering carried implicit obligations, whom to greet first, whose invitation to accept over another's, which conversation required careful management to avoid offence, the relative social looseness of a spa town's daily rhythm offered its own kind of relief. Acquaintances were made and left easily here, without the elaborate calculus of social advancement that governed introductions at home. A woman could simply nod to another guest at breakfast, exchange a pleasant word and let the acquaintance develop or fade entirely according to genuine inclination rather than strategic necessity. The resident physician's weekly examination, brief as it usually was, nonetheless offered something many of these women had rarely experienced before, an adult conversation focused entirely and specifically on her own well-being, conducted by someone whose professional attention for these 20 or 30 minutes belonged to her alone. Whatever the limitations of the diagnostic framework guiding these consultations, the simple experience of being asked directly how she was feeling carried its own quiet significance for women who had spent so many years being told, by implication, if not by direct statement, that the answer to that question mattered rather less than the answer to nearly anyone else's. The town's own long history as a place of healing predated by many centuries the specific American clientele this story concerns, and something of that older, deeper history seemed to inform the atmosphere a new arrival encountered, a sense of having entered a place whose entire purpose, across nearly 2,000 years, had remained essentially unchanged. Roman visitors had taken these same waters, had walked paths not far from the ones a Gilded Age wife would walk each afternoon, had sought, in their own era's language, relief from their own era's particular exhaustions. This continuity, sensed rather than consciously articulated by most visitors, lent the whole experience a quality of timelessness that made a single woman's particular season of rest feel, however briefly, connected to something considerably larger than her own individual circumstances. Autumn in the Black Forest brought its own particular beauty to the cure, the surrounding hillsides turning gold and deep red, the air carrying a crispness that made the warm mineral baths feel especially welcome after an afternoon walk. Many of the American women who arrived for a rest cure in these months later described, in letters home, this specific seasonal beauty with an attentiveness that suggests genuine, uncomplicated pleasure, perhaps the first purely aesthetic pleasure many of them had permitted themselves to notice and describe in years, unburdened by any obligation to translate the beauty into a social occasion or a household improvement. The hotel dining rooms in the evening offered their own quiet theatre of recovery, tables set with the same careful formality found in the finest establishments back home, but populated by a clientele whose conversation, once the initial pleasantries were exchanged, tended toward a gentler register than the competitive social performance of a New York dinner party. Here, among guests who understood without needing to be told exactly what circumstance had brought each of them to this particular table, the pressure to perform wit or charm or fashionable opinion relaxed considerably, replaced by something closer to genuine, unguarded conversation between people who had, in their own separate ways, all travelled a great distance to finally be permitted to rest. One final impression from these early days in the town deserves mention, the particular quality of the mornings, cool and mist-laced along the river before the sun cleared the surrounding hills, a stillness that most of these women had never had the occasion to witness before, having spent decades of mornings already occupied by the first demands of a household waking around them. Here, for perhaps the first time in her adult life, she could simply stand at a window and watch a morning arrive belonging to no one's need but her own. Consider, finally, how thoroughly the town's entire economy had oriented itself around the specific needs of visitors like her, an orientation that produced, almost incidentally, an environment where a tired woman's needs were treated as the central organizing purpose of an entire community, rather than an afterthought squeezed between everyone else's more pressing demands. Shopkeepers understood the slow pace their customers required. Waiters anticipated a quieter, more patient service than the brisk efficiency expected in a busy American dining room. Even the town's carriage drivers, accustomed to carrying invalid guests at a gentler pace than ordinary passengers, adjusted their entire manner to the specific rhythm this population required, a small but telling detail of just how completely the cure had been built into the very fabric of daily life here. As the days in the town accumulated into weeks, the specific rhythm of the cure became less a prescribed regimen, and more simply the shape of her days, waking, walking, drinking, bathing, resting, each element settling into a pattern that required no conscious effort to maintain, the way any sufficiently repeated routine eventually stops feeling like a set of instructions and starts feeling instead like the simple, natural texture of a life. There is one final dimension of the town worth adding to this account. The particular way its architecture itself seemed designed to slow a visitor's pace, without her needing to consciously decide to walk more slowly. Streets curved gently rather than running in the hard, efficient grids of an American city. Buildings rarely rose more than a few stories, keeping the surrounding hills and treetops visible from nearly every vantage point, rather than closing them off behind the taller structures of a more industrial place. Even the paving stones, worn smooth by more than a century of visitors taking exactly this same unhurried walk, seemed to invite a gentler footfall than the hard, purposeful stride her ordinary American life had trained into her. The town, in this sense, cured as much through its physical design as through any specific mineral property in its waters, an entire built environment quietly instructing its visitors, through every curve of every street, to simply slow down. And so the town received her, the way it had received so many tired women before her, without judgment, without urgency, offering nothing more complicated than warm water, quiet streets, and the simple, sufficient permission to rest for exactly as long as she required. Somewhere in the pattern of these unhurried days, a version of herself she had not encountered in decades began, quietly and without ceremony, to resurface, recognizable, familiar, simply glad at last to be given room to breathe. Whatever brought her here, the town asked nothing of her explanation, only her presence, morning after unhurried morning, for as long as she needed to stay. There, in the slow unfolding of an ordinary afternoon spent doing nothing more urgent than walking and resting, and watching the light change, she began to remember, gradually, what it had once felt like to simply exist without being needed by anyone else at all. Let the warmth of that thought settle over you now, the way the warm water settled over her, slow and mineral and undemanding, asking nothing of her at all except that she rest, finally, exactly as long as she needed to. She had not travelled entirely alone. Very few women of her circumstance did, because a married woman of social standing travelling unaccompanied across an ocean and through the hotels of a foreign continent would have raised exactly the kind of questions her husband and her physician had gone to such trouble to avoid. In her case, as in most, a companion had been engaged before the ship ever left New York, a woman whose entire professional function was to be present without being intrusive, watchful without being warm. The paid companion occupied a strange, undefined position in the social architecture of the period, somewhere between a servant and a friend, belonging fully to neither category. She was not staff in the way a lady's maid was staff, since she dined at the same table and was introduced to the same acquaintances, but she was not a friend either, since the relationship had been arranged and was being paid for, a fact both women understood perfectly well, even when neither one mentioned it aloud. Companions of this kind were often themselves women who had fallen, through widowhood or a family's reduced circumstances, out of the class they had been raised in, and this particular kind of employment allowed them to remain within its orbit, wearing its clothes, staying in its hotels, while earning the modest income that kept them from a more visible kind of poverty. It was, for many of them, a genuinely difficult position, requiring a constant, exhausting calibration between deference and companionship, between watching over a client and appearing not to be watching at all. The instructions given to a hired companion before the voyage began were rarely written down in full, but their outline can be reconstructed from the letters and household records that survive. She was to ensure the patient kept to the physician's schedule. She was to discourage any correspondence that seemed, in her judgment, agitating rather than restful. She was to report periodically to the husband back home a small but significant detail that meant the wife's own physician-prescribed rest was, in effect, being supervised and narrated by someone whose paycheck depended on the husband's continued satisfaction. This arrangement produced in many of these pairings a peculiar and delicate friendship, genuine in its warmth even while operating under the shadow of its true function. The two women spent nearly every hour of the day together for months at a time, took the waters together, walked the promenade together, dined together, and in the absence of anyone else who truly knew either of their circumstances, they frequently became each other's closest confidant, whatever the professional distance the arrangement was supposed to maintain. There are accounts, preserved in a handful of letters that survived their writers by more than a century, of companions who grew genuinely protective of the women in their care, who began, subtly, to manage the reports sent home in ways that favoured the wife's comfort over the husband's expectations, delaying an unwelcome piece of news, softening a description that might have prompted an earlier recall. It was a small rebellion, invisible to everyone but the two women involved, and it speaks to something the arrangement had not accounted for: the possibility that two women thrown together under these particular circumstances might come to see each other clearly, and might choose loyalty to each other over loyalty to the arrangement that had brought them together. Not every pairing worked this way, of course. Some companions took their supervisory roles seriously in the way their employer intended, reporting faithfully on every detail of the wife's mood, her appetite, her correspondence, her conversations with other guests at the hotel, functioning less as a companion than as a kind of gentle jailer, however genuinely she may have believed she was acting in the patient's best interest. The line between care and surveillance in this arrangement was rarely clean, and both women likely felt its blur at different points during the months they spent together. The days settled into a rhythm shaped as much by the companion's presence as by the physician's schedule. Breakfast together, quiet, unhurried. The walk to the Trincolor arm in arm, a habit that developed within the first week and continued for the length of the stay, less out of necessity than out of the simple, human comfort of not walking entirely alone. The bath, taken separately but discussed afterward over tea, the specific heat of the water, the attendant's particular manner, small observations exchanged the way old friends exchange them, even though these two women had known each other for a matter of weeks. In the evenings, after the concert, the two of them would sometimes sit together in the hotel's private parlour, and in that quiet hour, away from the physicians and the schedules and the reports that would eventually be sent home, something closer to real conversation could occur. A wife who had spent 2 decades managing a household without a single peer to confide in, a companion who had spent years managing other people's crises without anyone asking after her own, found in each other, for a season, exactly what neither had expected to find. Not a solution to either woman's circumstances, but company inside them. It is worth considering what this meant for the wife specifically, a woman who had likely arrived in Europe believing herself to be entirely alone in her particular unhappiness, only to discover, through the companion assigned to watch over her, that unhappiness of this shape was common enough to have generated an entire profession built around managing it. The companion had seen other wives, other rescuers, other households dissolving quietly at a distance, while the woman meant to save them drank mineral water in a foreign town. She knew, better than almost anyone else the wife might have spoken to, exactly how many women were living through some version of the same story. This knowledge, shared carefully over the weeks, did something the physicians and the mineral waters could not. It reframed the wife's situation from a personal failing, the nervous weakness she had been told she suffered from, into something closer to a pattern, a structure, a condition shared by women she would never meet, but whose ghostly parallel presence she could now sense in every hotel corridor and every promenade full of quietly resting women, walking arm in arm with their own hired companions. The companion, for her part, carried her own private grief through these months. The particular loneliness of a woman whose entire professional value depended on never quite becoming what she most resembled: a friend, a peer, an equal. She would leave this employment eventually and take up another very much like it, another wife, another rescuer, another season of careful, paid intimacy that could never fully acknowledge itself as intimacy at all. The economics of this profession deserve their own consideration, because a hired companion's wages, modest by the standards of the families who employed her, nonetheless represented a genuine independence for many of the women who took up this work, an income earned through her own labour rather than inherited or granted by a husband's goodwill. In an era when very few respectable avenues of paid employment existed for women of reduced but genteel circumstances, companionship of this kind occupied a particular, if uncomfortable, niche, dignified enough to preserve a woman's social standing, precarious enough to remind her constantly of exactly how easily that standing could be lost entirely. Some companions developed, across years of this work, a genuine expertise in the medical and social geography of the rescue circuit that rivaled or exceeded the knowledge of the physicians themselves, having observed dozens of cases, dozens of hotels, dozens of husbands, varying degrees of genuine concern or convenient absence. A companion on her fourth or fifth engagement of this kind could often assess, within the first week of a new assignment, exactly what category of situation she had entered, whether the wife in her care was genuinely unwell or primarily displaced, whether the correspondent's home required careful management or could be conducted honestly, whether the eventual return home was likely to be welcomed or dreaded. This accumulated expertise rarely appeared in any formal record, since the companion's professional value depended on a kind of practiced invisibility, her actual influence over the course of a patient's treatment, carefully hidden behind the appearance of simple, deferential attendance. But the letters and later reminiscences of a handful of these women, preserved by families who valued their long service, reveal individuals of considerable shrewdness and genuine compassion, navigating an impossible professional position with more skill and more care than the arrangement's original architects had likely anticipated when they conceived of the role as little more than a chaperone. The relationship between companion and patient was not without its own tensions, inevitably, since two women thrown together for months at a time, however genuine their eventual warmth, brought with them all the ordinary friction of extended close proximity. A companion's occasional insistence on adherence to the physician's schedule, however gently delivered, could grate against a patient's growing desire for more autonomy over her own days. A patient's occasional moods, understandable given her circumstances, could try the patience of a companion who was, after all, working, however warmly, rather than simply keeping company as a friend might. The agencies that placed these companions in wealthy households, a handful of which advertised discreetly in the better newspapers of the period, developed their own careful vetting process, seeking women whose social background matched closely enough to their prospective employers that no awkward gap of manner or education would disrupt the appearance of natural companionship, while ensuring, just as carefully, that the companion's own circumstances remained sufficiently reduced that she would have every practical incentive to perform her duties conscientiously. This careful calibration, matching social proximity with financial dependency, produced the specific, delicate dynamic that defined nearly every one of these relationships. A companion's day, structured almost entirely around her patient's schedule, left her remarkably little time that belonged purely to herself, a fact that some of the more reflective letters left behind by these women acknowledge with a kind of weary honesty. She rose when her patient rose, walked when her patient walked, dined when her patient dined, and retired only once her patient had safely settled for the night, an arrangement that offered steady employment and respectable lodging, but that asked in return a near-total surrender of the companion's own independent time, an irony not lost on women who had often taken up this work, specifically because their own circumstances had left them with too little independent security to refuse it. Despite this asymmetry, or perhaps because of the particular intimacy that shared circumstance tends to produce, many of these companion relationships left behind evidence of real affection that persisted well beyond the specific engagement that had created it. A handful of surviving letters show former patients writing years later to check on a companion's welfare, offering assistance in securing a new position, remembering birthdays and small anniversaries of their shared season abroad, evidence that whatever the arrangement's professional architecture, the women within it frequently built something considerably warmer and more lasting than the contract itself had required. One final note belongs here about the quiet gratitude some of these women expressed years later for a companion whose name history has otherwise forgotten entirely. In a small number of wills and bequests from this period, a former patient left a modest sum or a cherished piece of jewellery to the woman who had once accompanied her abroad, a final, formal acknowledgement of a bond that had never had a proper name within the social vocabulary of its time, but that had, in its quiet way, mattered enormously. Consider, too, the peculiar intimacy of sharing a hotel suite's adjoining rooms for months with someone who had, only weeks earlier, been a complete stranger. An intimacy neither planned nor entirely comfortable at first, but one that both women adjusted to with the same practiced adaptability that had shaped so much of their lives already. They learned each other's habits quickly out of necessity, which one preferred the window open at night, which one rose easily, and which needed coaxing. Small domestic accommodations that, in an ordinary friendship, might have taken years to accumulate, compressed here into the first several weeks of an arrangement that asked them to share nearly every waking hour. As the weeks passed, the companion's presence became, quietly, and without either woman quite noticing the shift, simply a fact of daily life rather than an arrangement requiring ongoing negotiation, the way any sufficiently sustained companionship eventually settles into something closer to habit than to conscious choice, comfortable in its familiarity regardless of the circumstances that had first produced it. There is one more consideration worth adding here about the companion's particular skill in managing the delicate emotional territory this role required, a skill developed through practice rather than any formal training, since no institution of the period offered instruction in the specific art of accompanying a wealthy woman through an extended quasi-medical exile. A truly gifted companion learned to read her patient's mood with a precision that rivaled the resident physician's own clinical assessment, sensing exactly when a topic of conversation should be gently steered elsewhere, exactly when silence served better than any offered comfort, exactly when a small suggested outing, a different walk, a different table at dinner, might lift a mood that had settled too heavily into homesickness or regret. This skill, unrecognised by any formal title or credential, constituted its own genuine expertise, one that the households employing these women rarely valued as highly as it likely deserved. And so, the two of them continued day after quiet day, an arrangement of convenience slowly deepening into something neither had expected but both had come, in their own separate and private ways, to genuinely value. Somewhere between the morning walks and the evening concerts, two women who had begun as strangers arranged by circumstance had become, without either one announcing it, something considerably closer to family. Whatever their arrangement had begun as, it had become, by the season's end, something considerably harder to name and considerably easier simply to feel. In the years afterward, whenever she thought back on this particular season, it was often the companion's face she remembered most clearly, steady and familiar, present through every quiet, uncertain week of it. But for these months, in this town, the two of them walked the same paths every morning, drank the same waters, sat through the same evening concerts, and built, out of an arrangement designed to be purely functional, something that resembled, closely enough to matter, genuine care. Let that thought carry you now, the quiet comfort of a companion who understands exactly what you're going through, even if she was technically paid to be there. By her third week in the town, she had begun to recognise faces. The dining room of a well-regarded spa hotel drew the same guests to the same tables, at the same hours, and within a matter of days a pattern of quiet nods, then brief introductions, then genuine acquaintance had established itself among a particular cluster of women who ate alone, or nearly alone, at tables set for two. A companion beside them, a husband's absence unremarked upon by anyone at the table, because it was, in this particular dining room, entirely unremarkable. There was, among these women, an unspoken system of recognition that required no direct question and no direct answer. A woman travelling with a hired companion rather than a husband, staying for a length of time measured in months rather than weeks, drinking the waters on the physician's exact schedule, was understood by the others in the room to belong to a category they all shared, whatever the specific and private reasons behind each individual case. No one asked outright, everyone understood. The first real conversation, when it came, often arrived sideways, through some small shared observation about the water's taste or the tedium of the morning walk, an opening remark that carried within it a kind of coded invitation. If the other woman responded in kind, if she matched the tone exactly, a small and wordless agreement had been reached that the conversation could, if both women wished it, go somewhere further than the weather or the waters. In the hotel's shared parlour, in the hour after dinner and before the evening concert, small groups of these women would gather, not by any formal arrangement, but by the simple gravitational pull of women who recognised in each other a version of their own circumstance. A woman from Boston whose husband had cited her exhaustion after the birth of a fifth child she had not particularly wanted. A woman from Philadelphia whose physician had used the word melancholia, a slightly different diagnosis carrying a slightly different weight, though the treatment prescribed was identical. A third woman, older than the rest, who had by this point made the crossing for her nerves nearly every year for over a decade, and who had come to think of the spa town with something between bitterness and genuine fondness as more truly her home than the house she returned to each winter. These conversations, once they began in earnest, rarely dwelled on self-pity, which the social code of the period would have found distasteful, even among women who understood each other's circumstances intimately. Instead, they took on a wry, almost conspiratorial humour, a shared vocabulary of small jokes about the language used to describe them. One woman might mention, with a dry and precise delivery, exactly the phrase her husband's letter had used. "For your health," she would say, imitating the particular careful tone men used when delivering a decision they had already made. And the other women at the table would laugh, not because it was funny exactly, but because the recognition of a shared script, repeated across so many households that had never met one another, was its own kind of relief. There was comfort, too, in the practical knowledge these women exchanged, a kind of informal expertise built up through repeated experience of the exact circumstance they were all navigating, which physicians in the town were genuinely attentive, and which merely repeated whatever diagnosis had arrived with the patient's paperwork from home, which hotels handled correspondence with discretion, and which forwarded letters, unopened but noted, to a husband who had quietly requested to be kept informed of his wife's mail, which spa towns, further along the circuit that many of these women would eventually travel, offered the gentlest physicians and the most genuinely restorative rhythm of days. This informal network extended for some of these women well beyond the season at any single hotel. Letters were exchanged after departures, addresses collected, a loose and unofficial correspondence maintained across years and continents, among women who had met for a single season at a spa town and recognised in each other something rare enough to preserve. A few of these friendships, based on the letters that survive in family archives and historical societies, lasted decades, longer in some cases than the marriages that had first sent these women abroad. It is worth considering what this society actually offered its members beyond simple companionship. For many of these women, it was the first sustained experience of friendship built entirely on mutual understanding rather than social obligation. The friendships of their ordinary lives, the ones cultivated through the same dinner parties and charity committees that had exhausted them in the first place, were frequently friendships of duty, maintained because a husband's business required it, or a daughter's marriage prospects depended on it. Here, in a hotel parlour 3,000 miles from any of that obligation, friendship could exist for no reason other than the simple, rare fact of being understood. There were tensions within this society too, inevitable among any group of women drawn from the same competitive social world that had shaped them at home. Old rivalries occasionally travelled across the Atlantic intact, a slight remembered from a New York dinner party resurfacing unexpectedly over tea in a German hotel. But even these tensions were softened, in most accounts, by the shared circumstance underlying them. Whatever competition had once divided these women at home, they were, in this particular room at this particular hour, all navigating some version of the same quiet exile, and that shared fact had a way of dissolving old grievances that might otherwise have persisted. The evening concerts, attended nightly by nearly the entire American colony of the town, became their own kind of gathering, less for the music, which was pleasant but rarely remarkable, than for the hour of shared company it guaranteed. Women who had spent the day separately, at their baths and their walks and their prescribed rests, would find each other again in the concert hall, seated in loose clusters, exchanging quiet observations between movements, the music providing a kind of acceptable cover for conversation that might otherwise have seemed, to the more conservative members of the hotel's clientele, unbecomingly social for women meant to be resting. By the end of her stay, she would have accumulated a small circle of women she trusted in a way she had not trusted anyone in years, women who understood, without needing the specifics explained, exactly what kind of letter had arrived at exactly what kind of breakfast table to set each of them on this same path. It was a strange gift, wrapped inside a circumstance that had cost each of them dearly, and most of these women, in their private letters, seemed to recognize the strangeness even as they treasured what it had given them. This society extended, in some documented instances, into forms of genuine mutual aid that went well beyond conversation and companionship. Women with greater financial resources or stronger family connections sometimes quietly assisted others whose circumstances were more precarious. A loan offered discreetly to a companion facing an unexpected gap between engagements. A letter of introduction written on behalf of a woman seeking to extend her stay through means less dependent on her husband's continued goodwill. These small acts of mutual support, rarely documented explicitly because they touched on matters of money and independence that polite correspondents of the period preferred not to discuss directly, nonetheless left traces in the gratitude expressed, sometimes only obliquely, in letters exchanged long after the season that had produced the friendship had ended. The society also produced its own quiet gossip network, inevitable among any group of people who shared as much genuine intimacy as these women came to share across a season of shared meals and shared confidences. News of a particular husband's behaviour, a particular physician's questionable judgment, a particular hotel's discretion or lack of it, travelled quickly through this network, reaching women who had never met the parties involved, but who benefited nonetheless from the accumulated collective knowledge of women who had, between them, encountered nearly every variation this particular circumstance could produce. For younger women occasionally present within this otherwise older cohort, women in their 30s sent abroad somewhat earlier than the typical pattern this story traces, the society of the sent away offered something closer to mentorship. Older women sharing not just practical knowledge of the circuit, but a kind of hard-won perspective on marriage and womanhood that these younger visitors had rarely encountered so directly. A woman of 45, having navigated 2 decades of exactly the marital and social pressures now beginning to weigh on a woman of 33, could offer counsel that no unmarried advisor and no younger peer could have provided with the same authority. It is worth noting, too, how this society occasionally reshaped the individual conversations these women eventually had with their own husbands once they returned home. A wife who had spent months among other women openly discussing, in whatever coded language the era permitted, the shortcomings of their respective marriages, returned home considerably less inclined to accept those shortcomings as simply the unexamined natural order of things. The society of the sent away, whatever its original architects had intended, functioned in practice as an informal school of comparison, and comparison, once genuinely undertaken, has a way of clarifying exactly what a person is and is not willing to continue accepting. Photographs from this period, where they survive in family albums, occasionally capture something of this society in its casual, unposed moments. Small clusters of women seated together on a hotel terrace, their expressions considerably more relaxed and unguarded than the careful, formal portraits taken for occasions back home. These images, rare as they are, offer a visual counterpart to the letters and diaries this chapter has drawn upon, a glimpse of women who look, in these unguarded moments, less like patients undergoing treatment, and more like friends genuinely enjoying each other's company, however temporary, and however unusually they had come to find themselves in it. The society also occasionally produced, among its more literary-minded members, informal written accounts of the whole phenomenon, essays or extended letters that attempted to capture, for an audience of friends back home, exactly what this particular world of resting American women actually looked like from the inside. A few of these accounts survive, written with a wit and a self-awareness that suggests their authors understood quite clearly the strangeness of their own circumstances, describing the parade of similarly diagnosed women with an affectionate, ironic humour that reads, "Even now, as a form of quiet resistance against a system that preferred these women remain unexamined and uncommented upon." One last observation belongs to this account of the society of the sent away, the particular tenderness with which these women marked each other's departures when a member of the group finally received word that she could return home. Small gifts exchanged, a final dinner arranged in her honour, an exchange of addresses meant sincerely rather than as mere formality, the group briefly reconstituting itself around the recognition that one of their number was rejoining a life the rest of them had not yet been permitted to rejoin themselves. Consider too how this society occasionally crossed national lines, drawing in European women navigating remarkably similar circumstances under their own culture's particular vocabulary for the same fundamental arrangement. A German, or French, or English wife, sent to the same waters for reasons that differed in their specific cultural framing, but not in their underlying logic, occasionally joined these American circles, the shared circumstance proving in the end considerably stronger than any barrier of language or nationality. Further evidence that whatever this pattern was, it belonged to no single country's marriage customs alone, but reflected something closer to a shared condition of privileged womanhood across the entire industrialized world of the era. As the season drew toward its close, this particular gathering of women, however temporary its original formation, had come to feel to many of its members like something considerably more permanent than circumstance alone could explain. A community formed not through any deliberate choice, but through the simple, accumulated fact of showing up, day after day, to the same terrace, the same waters, the same quiet recognition of a shared condition none of them had chosen, but all of them had in their own way learned to hold together. There is a final quality of this society worth naming plainly, the particular relief of simply not having to explain oneself from the very beginning of an acquaintance. The way ordinary friendships often require a slow accumulation of shared context before real understanding becomes possible. Here, among women who had each arrived carrying some version of the same essential circumstance, that lengthy preamble of explanation could be skipped almost entirely. A woman could sit down at a table with a stranger and, within a single conversation, feel more genuinely understood than she'd felt in years of far older friendships back home. Friendships that, however long-standing, had never actually been given the specific vocabulary or the specific occasion to address what she was truly living through. And so this quiet, unofficial society continued season after season, welcoming new members and releasing old ones back toward their separate homes. A community built entirely out of shared circumstance, and yet, for the women within it, as genuine and as sustaining as any friendship deliberately chosen. Somewhere in that hotel parlour among women who understood without being told, an entire quiet history of shared endurance was being written, one evening at a time, in a language no household back home had ever taught them to speak aloud. Whatever else this circumstance had cost her, it had also given her this, a table full of women who understood entirely without asking her to explain. In that quiet parlour, among women whose names she'd not known a month earlier, she had found something her own decades-long social calendar back home, crowded as it was with familiar faces, had somehow never quite managed to offer her, the simple, sufficient comfort of being genuinely understood. Let this thought settle now, the quiet knowledge that whatever brought you here, you were never travelling this particular road entirely alone. Other women walked it before you, and other women walk it now in hotel rooms not so different from this one, and somewhere among them, even now, someone is drinking the same water, watching the same slow evening settle over the same green valley, thinking of home in the same careful, complicated way you're thinking of it tonight. The writing desk in her hotel room saw more use than any piece of furniture she had owned at home. Letters to the children, letters to her sister, letters occasionally to her husband, each one composed with a care that went beyond simple correspondence, because every letter she sent across the Atlantic travelled, in a sense, through more hands and more judgments than the words on the page could account for. A letter written on a Tuesday would not leave the hotel until the next post collection, would travel by rail to the port, would wait for a ship, would cross the ocean in the hold of a vessel not so different from the one that had carried her east, would arrive in New York perhaps 12 or 14 days after it was written, and would then wait, again, for whatever schedule governed its delivery to the house. A question asked in a letter dated the 3rd of October would not receive its answer until close to the middle of November, and by then the question itself had often been overtaken by whatever had happened in the intervening weeks, rendering the entire careful correspondence a conversation conducted permanently out of joint with itself. This delay shaped the tone of everything she wrote. There was no use asking a pressing question and expecting a timely answer, so pressing questions were rarely asked at all. Instead, the letters settled into a kind of performed calm. Descriptions of the weather, the waters, the concerts, small pleasant details assembled carefully to reassure whoever read them that the rescue was proceeding exactly as intended, that she was, in the vocabulary of the period, improving. Whether this performed calm reflected her actual state of mind is a separate question entirely, and it is one the letters themselves, by their very design, cannot fully answer. A woman writing home under these circumstances understood, consciously or not, that her letters would likely be read not only by their intended recipient but potentially by others in the household, that a letter expressing genuine distress might prompt exactly the kind of concerned intervention that could extend her stay rather than shorten it, and that the safest, most strategic tone to adopt was one of steady, reassuring improvement, regardless of what she actually felt. There is evidence, in the private diaries some of these women kept alongside their more careful correspondence, that the gap between the letters and the diary entries could be considerable. A letter to a husband might describe a pleasant week of rest and mild improvement, while the diary entry from the same week recorded a much rawer account, homesickness for the children, a specific and unresolved anger at the circumstances of her departure, a loneliness that no amount of mineral water seemed able to touch. The letters were, in this sense, a kind of performance sustained across an ocean, a carefully managed correspondence designed to produce a specific outcome rather than to communicate an honest interior state. This was not necessarily deceitful in the way that word suggests, it was more precisely a survival strategy, learned quickly by nearly every woman who found herself in this circumstance. The household back home operated according to its own logic, and a wife's letters were one of the only tools she had left to influence that logic from a distance. A letter that seemed too distressed risked prolonging her absence, since a physician receiving such news, even second-hand through a husband's report, might recommend an extended treatment. A letter that seemed appropriately calm and improving, on the other hand, built toward the eventual argument that the cure had succeeded and that a return home was warranted. The letters she received in return carried their own careful architecture. A husband writing to a wife undergoing a rescue understood, in this period's medical thinking, that his letters should avoid anything that might agitate her nerves. News of household difficulties was generally softened or omitted entirely. A servant's dismissal, a child's minor illness that had since resolved, a financial worry that had passed, these things were frequently left out of the correspondence altogether, on the theory that a wife recovering from nervous exhaustion should not be burdened with problems she could not, from such a distance, actually solve. This meant that the household she was hearing about in these careful curated letters was frequently a household somewhat different from the one that actually existed in her absence. Not falsified exactly, but edited, smoothed, presented in a version calibrated for her supposed fragility, rather than for the truth of what was actually occurring in the rooms she had left behind. She would return home, eventually, to discover small differences between the household described in the letters and the household she found waiting, differences that had accumulated, unremarked, across months of correspondence designed more to soothe than to inform. The children's letters carried a different weight entirely, and by most accounts these were the ones she read most carefully, sometimes several times, sometimes late at night when the day's prescribed activities had finally ended and the room had gone quiet. A child's handwriting, still uneven, describing a small incident from the schoolroom, or a pet's antics, or a simple, uncomplicated wish for her return, arrived without any of the careful management that characterized the adult correspondence. Children, mercifully, did not yet know how to perform calm for someone else's benefit, and their letters, however brief, offered her something the rest of her correspondence rarely did, an honest, unfiltered glimpse of the life continuing without her. There were women, in this particular chapter of history, who used their letters home for something closer to genuine communication despite all these pressures, who wrote with real honesty about their loneliness, their questions, their growing clarity about the circumstances of their marriage. These letters, when they survive, offer some of the most striking documents of the period, glimpses of women beginning slowly, across the distance the rescuer had created, to see their own situation with a clarity that proximity to the household had never permitted. Distance, whatever its intended medical purpose, had an unintended side effect that none of the physicians had accounted for. It gave a woman room to think. A letter once posted could not be recalled or revised. She would have sat with each one before sealing it, reading it back, wondering how it would land in a house she could no longer picture with complete accuracy, wondering what her husband's face might do as he read whatever careful, measured account she had assembled of her days. She would seal the envelope anyway, hand it to the hotel's concierge for the next post, and then wait, again, the long silent interval before any reply could possibly arrive. An interval that gave her, whether she wanted it or not, an enormous amount of unstructured time to sit with her own thoughts. It is worth considering what that time did to her across the weeks and months of a stay that stretched, as these stays so often did, well beyond its original 3 months. A woman who had spent 2 decades responding immediately to whatever her household required of her was now living inside a correspondence with built-in delay, a conversation that moved at the pace of ships rather than the pace of urgency, and in the wide gaps between sending a letter and receiving its answer she had, for the first time in longer than she could remember, nothing to do but think. The physical letters themselves, when a handful survive in family archives, offer their own quiet testimony beyond the words written on the page. The handwriting in an early letter, composed within the first weeks of a stay, often shows a controlled, careful formality, the practiced penmanship of a woman still performing composure for an audience she cannot see. Letters written months later, in some of these surviving collections, show a subtle loosening, a slightly less guarded hand, occasional crossings out and revisions that suggest a writer growing more willing to say what she actually meant, rather than only what seemed safest to say. Some households developed elaborate systems for managing this correspondence that went beyond the simple back and forth of husband and wife. A trusted family friend or relative might serve as an intermediary, receiving a wife's letters first, forwarding only what seemed appropriate to the husband, occasionally softening or contextualizing news in either direction, to smooth the inevitable friction of a marriage being conducted almost entirely through delayed written words. This arrangement, when it existed, added yet another layer of mediation between a wife's actual thoughts and whatever eventually reached her husband's desk, another set of hands shaping the story before it arrived at its destination. The postal officials and ship's mail clerks who handled this correspondence, though they left almost no individual trace in the historical record, functioned as an essential and entirely anonymous link in this long chain, sorting and transferring thousands of these careful cross-ocean letters with a reliability that the writers rarely paused to appreciate. A letter that reached its destination at all, across an ocean, in an era of limited and occasionally unreliable transportation, represented a small triumph of infrastructure that made this entire pattern of extended, managed absence logistically possible in the first place. There is a particular kind of letter that appears with some regularity in the surviving record, one that a woman drafted several times before settling on a final version, the earlier drafts sometimes preserved alongside the sent copy in a family's papers. These multiple drafts, when they survive, offer a rare and valuable glimpse into exactly how much careful revision went into presenting the right tone, the right balance of reassurance and honest sentiment, the right amount of longing for home without appearing so distressed as to alarm anyone into an unwanted intervention. Each draft represents a small negotiation between what she felt and what she judged it safe to say. It is worth imagining, too, the reverse correspondence, the letters written by children old enough to compose their own, under the gentle supervision of a governess or tutor who reviewed the content before it was sealed and posted. Even a child's letter, in this careful household culture, was not always entirely free of adult mediation, a detail worth remembering when reading the surviving examples of children's correspondence from this period, letters that appear spontaneous and unfiltered, but that occasionally carry, beneath their childish handwriting, the faint trace of an adult's guiding hand. The postal rates and the specific mail steamers that connected Europe to America in this period followed a schedule wealthy families came to know almost by heart, certain sailing days becoming, within a household, small informal deadlines around which the week organised itself. A letter that missed Wednesday's post might wait until Saturday, an additional delay that, layered onto the already considerable time a letter took to cross the ocean, could stretch a simple exchange of news into a conversation spanning the better part of 2 months from question to answer, an experience of correspondence almost unimaginable to anyone accustomed to the instant expectations of a later century. Some of the surviving letters from this period include small marginal notes, added after the main body of the letter had been composed, updates to news that had changed in the days between drafting and posting, evidence of writers trying, imperfectly, to keep their correspondence current against the inevitable erosion that delay imposed on any news. A death, a recovery, a change of plans, sometimes appeared as hurried postscripts squeezed into the margins, the writer's awareness of the letter's coming obsolescence prompting one final attempt to say something true before the envelope was sealed, and the news, whatever it was, began its slow journey into the past. One final thought belongs here, about the particular letters that never got sent at all, the drafts abandoned halfway through, the honest paragraph crossed out and replaced with something gentler. The private thoughts that existed only on paper, meant for no eyes but her own. These unsent letters, where a handful survive tucked into diaries or private papers, may in fact tell the truest version of this entire correspondence, precisely because they were never shaped by the knowledge that someone else would eventually read them. Consider, too, the particular vulnerability of a woman who understood that her letters might be shared beyond her husband's own reading, passed among family members, or even discussed, in careful summary, with the physician overseeing her treatment. This awareness shaped her writing at a level deeper than simple tone, influencing which topics she considered safe to raise at all, which private thoughts remained permanently unwritten because the risk of their circulation beyond a single intended reader felt too great to accept. The letter, in this sense, was never truly a private form of communication for these women. It was closer to a carefully managed public document, addressed to one person, but written with an awareness of several possible additional readers standing just behind him. As the months accumulated, the rhythm of writing and waiting became its own kind of meditation, an exercise in releasing a thought into the world without any expectation of immediate response, a discipline that, however unintentionally acquired, taught its own quiet lesson in patience that no physician's prescription had specifically included, but that may, in the end, have been among the most genuinely restorative habits the entire journey produced. One further quality of this correspondence deserves inclusion here. The way certain phrases, repeated letter after letter across the months, took on a significance beyond their plain meaning, becoming a kind of private code between a wife and the family she had left. A simple closing line, written the same way in nearly every letter, might carry, for a husband reading it, a specific and recognizable reassurance that went beyond its literal words, a signal that all remained essentially well, that no deeper trouble lurked beneath the calm surface of the correspondence. The absence of that familiar phrase, in a letter that otherwise seemed ordinary, could register to a careful reader as its own small and unspoken message, a subtlety of communication built entirely from the accumulated pattern of dozens of previous letters, rather than from anything stated directly in the one at hand. And so the letters continued to cross the ocean in both directions, slow and careful and never quite complete, carrying between two shores a marriage that had learned, out of necessity, to exist for a season primarily on paper. Somewhere in the space between one letter and its reply, a marriage was being quietly conducted at the pace of ships and tides, patient and imperfect, doing its best to hold together across an ocean it had never expected to need to cross. Whatever these letters could or could not fully say, they kept a thread stretched across the ocean, thin but unbroken, connecting two lives learning to exist, for a while, at a considerable distance from each other. Each envelope she sealed carried, alongside its careful words, a small private hope that whoever opened it on the other side would read, somewhere between the lines, the truer letter she had not quite found the words to write outright. Let the slowness of that correspondence become your own rhythm now. No answer needs to arrive quickly tonight. No question needs resolving before you sleep. Let the words drift the way her letters drifted, across dark water, unhurried, arriving eventually, or not arriving at all, and let none of it matter very much before morning. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. Back across the ocean, in the house she had left in early autumn, something was happening that the careful letters had not fully described. Not a scandal exactly, not in most cases, but a quiet reorganisation, the kind that occurs in any household once its central organising presence has been removed for long enough that other arrangements begin to feel, gradually, less temporary. The housekeeper who had answered to her for years now answered more directly to the husband, or to whoever he designated in her place. Decisions that would once have waited for her opinion, the choice of a new carpet for the front hall, the dismissal of an underperforming servant, the menu for a dinner party honouring a business associate were made without her, not out of malice, but simply because the household could not pause indefinitely for a woman who might not return for months. In some of these houses, a female relative moved in to manage what remained, an unmarried sister, a widowed aunt, someone available and willing to take up the daily operation of a household that could not run itself. This arrangement was generally presented in the letters home as a practical solution and nothing more, and in many cases that description was entirely accurate. But in others, the relative who moved in to manage the household developed, across the months of the wife's absence, an intimacy with the husband and the children that outlasted the original arrangement's intended temporariness, an intimacy that the returning wife would sometimes find, upon her arrival home, uncomfortably settled into the rhythms of daily life. There is a particular kind of history that survives only in the gaps between what was written and what was true, and the households described in this story are full of such gaps. A letter describing a pleasant, uneventful season at home, when set against other surviving records, financial ledgers, servants' later recollections, the occasional indiscreet mention in someone else's diary, sometimes reveals a household that was considerably less settled than the correspondence suggested. New arrangements, new routines. In some documented cases, a woman other than the wife, sometimes a companion of the husband's own choosing, becoming a regular and increasingly permanent fixture at the same dinner table the wife had once presided over. This was, of course, not universal. Many husbands in this story missed their wives genuinely, wrote to them with real affection, counted the months until a physician's letter might finally authorise a return home. The story this chapter is telling is not the story of every marriage that produced a rescuer, but it is a pattern documented often enough, in enough surviving correspondence and enough later scholarship, that it deserves to be named plainly rather than politely avoided. For some of these husbands, the wife's absence was not merely tolerated, it was, in ways never stated aloud, useful. The redecoration of a house, when it occurred during a wife's extended absence, tells its own quiet story. A room repainted in a colour she would not have chosen. Furniture rearranged according to a taste that was not hers. These changes were sometimes explained in the letters as improvements undertaken in her honour, a surprise she would return to and enjoy. And sometimes, in the accounts that survive from servants, or from the women themselves upon their return, they were experienced very differently, as evidence of a household that had begun making decisions as though her opinion, her presence, her authority over these rooms, no longer required consulting. The children, meanwhile, were adjusting in their own particular way to an absence that, for the youngest among them, might stretch across a significant fraction of their conscious memory. A child of 6 or 7 told that mother had gone to Europe to rest, did not fully grasp the scale of months the way an adult would, and by the time she returned some children had settled into new routines, new caretakers, a new rhythm of days that did not, in every detail, include the specific shape of her presence the way it once had. This was, for many returning mothers, among the most quietly devastating discoveries of the entire ordeal. The sense that even the children, the reason so often given for why a mother's exhaustion mattered enough to require treatment, had adapted in her absence to a household that functioned without her. There is a particular kind of pain in being told your presence is essential, and then discovering upon a long enough absence exactly how replaceable that presence turned out to be. It is worth sitting with the contradiction embedded in the entire premise of the rescuer. A wife was sent away because her labour, her constant management of the household's countless moving parts, was believed to have exhausted her past the point of safe continuation. And yet the household, once she left, did not collapse without her. It adjusted. It found other hands, other arrangements, and it continued, imperfectly but functionally in her absence, a fact that quietly undermined the very justification that had sent her away in the first place. What this suggests, though none of the physicians of the period would have framed it this way, is that the exhaustion these women suffered from was rarely about the sheer volume of labour a household required. It was about the fact that the labour was entirely hers to carry, unacknowledged, unshared, and unrelieved, regardless of how tired she became. A household that could suddenly reorganise itself around her absence was a household that had always had more capacity for shared management than it had ever actually offered her while she was present to ask for it. This realisation, when it dawned on a woman during her months abroad, arrived slowly and usually without the vocabulary to articulate it fully. She might notice it first as a kind of quiet, unnamed resentment, reading her husband's cheerful letters describing how well everyone was managing without her. She might notice it as a small, unfamiliar anger at a redecorated parlour she had not been consulted about. She might notice it, most painfully, in a child's letter that described a new routine with a new caretaker in a tone of complete untroubled acceptance. None of this necessarily meant the marriage or the household was beyond repair. Many of these women returned home and resumed their previous roles, sometimes with genuine relief, sometimes with a complicated mixture of relief and resignation that never fully resolved itself in either direction. But something had shifted during the months of distance, a small and permanent crack in the assumption that had governed her entire adult life, the assumption that she was, in some essential and irreplaceable way, the thing holding the household together. Household staff watching this reorganisation occur from their own particular vantage point often understood its full shape more clearly than either the husband or the wife, positioned as they were to observe both the letters that were sent and the actual daily reality of the house that produced them. A housekeeper or a butler, loyal in principle to the entire family but managing the practical operation of the household day to day, sometimes found themselves navigating a delicate position, aware of discrepancies between the household described in outgoing correspondence and the household actually functioning around them, choosing, in most cases, discretion over disclosure, since their own continued employment depended considerably more on the husband's satisfaction than on any abstract loyalty to the absent wife. Financial records from households of this period, where they survive in sufficient detail, sometimes reveal their own quiet story of a household's changing patterns during a wife's extended absence, new expenditures appearing that had not featured in the household's previous budget, entertainment costs shifting in ways that suggest changes to the social calendar the wife would once have managed personally. These ledgers rarely explain themselves directly, but read alongside the correspondence and the later accounts of servants and relatives, they contribute to the fuller, more complicated picture of exactly what continued in a wife's absence, and exactly how much of it she would eventually discover upon her return. There is also the matter of the wife's own household authority, which in many of these families rested on a foundation considerably less secure than her decades of labour might suggest it deserved. Her management of the household, however skilled and however essential to its daily functioning, existed largely at her husband's ongoing sufferance, rather than through any independent legal or financial standing of her own. This meant that a prolonged absence carried a particular risk beyond the emotional difficulty of separation from her family, the practical risk that her authority, once relinquished even temporarily to other hands, might not be fully restored upon her return, a possibility that some of these women appear to have sensed, with real anxiety, even before any concrete evidence confirmed it. Not every household story during this period of absence tells a tale of quiet displacement, however. Some husbands, genuinely devoted and genuinely uncomfortable managing a household on their own, found the months of their wife's absence considerably more difficult than the confident tone of their letters suggested, muddling through decisions they had never previously needed to make, discovering, often for the first time, exactly how much invisible labour their wife's presence had always absorbed without complaint or acknowledgement. These husbands, upon their wife's return, sometimes expressed a newfound appreciation that reshaped the remainder of the marriage in genuinely positive ways, a small but meaningful silver lining within a larger history that offers relatively few of them. Neighbours and social acquaintances, observing a household during a wife's extended absence, often formed their own private judgments about exactly what kind of household this had become, judgments rarely spoken aloud, but sometimes preserved in the diaries and letters of the observers themselves rather than the family in question. A dinner hosted by the husband alone, or with a female relative presiding in the wife's place, drew a particular kind of careful, curious attention from a social circle well practiced in reading precisely this sort of arrangement for whatever it might reveal about the true state of a marriage everyone had assumed, until recently, to be entirely conventional. The specific texture of a household's daily rhythm, its meal times, its patterns of quiet and activity, its unspoken hierarchies among the staff, tended to shift gradually during an extended absence in ways that no single decision fully explained but that accumulated week upon week into something noticeably different from the household the wife had left. Children's bedtimes might shift by half an hour. A previously strict rule about parlour use might relax. These small changes, individually trivial, together constituted a household quietly renegotiating itself in her absence. A renegotiation she would eventually have to read and interpret upon her return, piecing together from 100 small signals exactly how much had actually changed. One final observation belongs here about the particular resilience of a well-run household staff, whose collective competence, built over years of careful training and institutional memory, allowed a house to weather even a significant absence without genuine collapse. This resilience, admirable in itself, carried its own quiet irony, since it was built in no small part on the systems and standards the absent wife herself had first established, her invisible architecture continuing to hold the household together even while she herself was thousands of miles away. Consider, finally, the particular position of a husband navigating this extended period alone, a position that carried its own social scrutiny, even as it carried far greater latitude than his wife's absence had carried for her. A husband managing a household without his wife present drew, at most, mild, sympathetic comment from his social circle, an acknowledgement that he was managing admirably under difficult circumstances, a framing considerably gentler than any equivalent scrutiny a wife would have faced managing a household without her husband present for a comparable stretch of time. This asymmetry of social judgment, subtle but consistent, shaped the entire experience of the absence for both parties, granting the husband a freedom of movement and reputation that the wife's own extended absence, however medically justified, never quite extended to her in return. As the months of her absence stretched onward, the household's new equilibrium became, gradually, simply its equilibrium, no longer experienced by anyone within it as a temporary adjustment, but as the ordinary, unremarkable shape of daily life, a settling that would make her eventual return, whenever it came, considerably more complicated to navigate than anyone at the outset had likely anticipated. One further consideration deserves inclusion here: the specific experience of the household's eldest daughters during this period, girls old enough to notice the changes occurring around them, but young enough to still be forming their own expectations about what marriage and household management would eventually require of them. These daughters, watching their mother's absence reshape the household's daily patterns, absorbed a lesson their mothers had never directly intended to teach, that household smooth operation depended on an invisible labour easily taken for granted, until its absence made the labour, briefly, visible. Some of these daughters, by their own later accounts, carried this early lesson forward into their own adult households, determined to secure for themselves an acknowledgement their own mothers had only received through the strange, indirect mechanism of a forced departure. And so the house continued, quietly rearranging itself around her absence, learning month by month exactly how much it could manage without the woman who had once seemed to hold every one of its countless moving parts together by will alone. Somewhere within its familiar walls, the household was quietly discovering a truth it would never say aloud to her directly, that it had always held more capacity to share her burden than it had ever previously been asked to demonstrate. Whatever the house had become in her absence, it remained still waiting for her, the way houses wait, patiently and without judgment, for whoever eventually walks back through the door. The rooms she had once managed so carefully carried on, imperfectly but steadily, under other hands for a season, proof, gentle and unintended, that the household's survival had never depended quite as entirely on her single presence as either she or anyone else within it had ever fully believed. None of it diminished what she had given the household across 2 decades. It only revealed, gently and a little painfully, that the giving had always had more give left in the people around her than anyone had thought to ask for. Let this thought pass through you gently now, without alarm. Whatever it reveals about the fragility of what we believe ourselves essential to, it also quietly reveals something else. A house can breathe without you for a season. That does not mean it does not want you back. It only means the rest, wherever it came from, however it arrived, was perhaps more necessary than anyone, including you, had understood. For a woman whose rest cure extended beyond a single season, and many did, the geography of the treatment expanded to include a whole circuit of towns, each with its own reputation, its own specialty of waters, its own particular society of resting Americans who moved between them according to a calendar as fixed and as social as any season back home had ever been. Vichy in central France drew visitors for waters believed especially suited to digestive complaints, though by this period its clientele included a broad range of conditions, real and diagnosed, and somewhere in between. The town had been developed with real deliberateness by the French state. Wide boulevards, an elegant casino, gardens laid out for the exact kind of slow, prescribed walking that constituted so much of the treatment across every town on this circuit. American visitors arrived in significant enough numbers that certain hotels catered specifically to them, offering menus adjusted to American tastes and staff who had learned enough English to manage the particular anxieties of wealthy foreign guests. Carlsbad, further east in Bohemia, carried an older and in some ways more serious reputation. A town that had drawn European royalty and aristocracy for generations, before American visitors began arriving in significant numbers, its waters believed particularly effective for the liver and the general nervous constitution. The town's physicians had refined, over decades of treating the same category of wealthy, tired visitor, an entire philosophy of the cure, precise schedules of drinking, bathing and walking calibrated to the individual patient's specific complaint, administered with a formality that some American visitors found almost military in its precision, and others found, after the vagueness of their own physicians back home, deeply reassuring. Moving between these towns was itself a significant undertaking, involving trains, porters, letters of introduction sent ahead to secure appropriate accommodations, and a companion managing the countless small logistics that made travel of this kind possible for a woman who, at home, would rarely have arranged so much as a carriage without assistance. And yet, by the second or third town on the circuit, many of these women had grown remarkably capable at managing exactly this kind of movement, a competence that would have surprised the physicians who had originally diagnosed them as too nervously depleted to manage ordinary household affairs. This is worth pausing on because it points to something the medical framework of the period never quite reconciled. A woman deemed too exhausted to continue running a household of familiar routines back home proved entirely capable, within a matter of weeks, of navigating unfamiliar train stations in foreign languages, managing hotel arrangements across 3 or 4 countries, and adjusting to an entirely new social environment every few weeks, as the circuit moved her from one town to the next. The exhaustion, whatever its true source, evidently did not extend to every category of demanding activity. It extended specifically to the demands of the household and the marriage she had left behind. Each town along the circuit developed among the travelling American colony its own reputation and its own particular character. Baden-Baden was considered the most sociable, its evening concerts and its casino drawing a crowd that mixed rest with a genuine, if restrained, kind of pleasure. Carlsbad was considered the most serious, its regimented schedule appealing to visitors who wanted their treatment to feel rigorous rather than merely restful. Vichy fell somewhere between the two, popular enough to guarantee company, structured enough to feel legitimately medicinal. The women who moved along this circuit season after season, sometimes for years, developed an expertise in the unofficial rules governing each location, which hotels offered them most discretion, which physicians were most sympathetic to a patient who simply needed a season of genuine rest rather than an aggressive course of treatment, which towns permitted the loosest social rules for women travelling without husbands, allowing for dinners and outings that would have raised eyebrows in more conservative settings. This knowledge, passed between women through the informal network established in hotel parlours and shared train compartments, constituted its own kind of education, one no finishing school back home had ever offered. There was, among the women who travelled this circuit repeatedly, a recognisable type, women who had come to think of themselves less as patients undergoing treatment than as seasoned travellers with genuine expertise in the geography and society of European rest. Some of these women, by their third or fourth year of the pattern, had developed friendships and routines abroad, more substantial and more genuinely their own than anything remaining to them at home, a fact that occasionally troubled their husbands, who had, after all, initially sent them abroad expecting a temporary absence rather than a semi-permanent second life. This raises a question worth sitting with honestly. For some of these women, was the eventual return home actually desired, or had the circuit itself, whatever its original coercive purpose, become a genuine escape they were reluctant to relinquish? The historical record offers glimpses of both. Letters expressing real longing for children left behind, genuine homesickness for a specific garden or a specific view from a specific window, and letters from other women that grow noticeably less enthusiastic about return as the months pass, correspondence that finds increasingly practical reasons why the treatment should perhaps continue a while longer. It would be too simple to say that every woman on this circuit secretly preferred her exile to her marriage. Many genuinely missed home and counted the days until they could reasonably return, but it would be equally too simple to ignore the women whose letters suggest a growing unspoken reluctance to go back to a household that had, by every account, learned to function comfortably without them, to a marriage that had sent them away with a diagnosis rather than a conversation, to a life in which their exhaustion had been treated as a medical condition rather than a reasonable response to the conditions of their existence. By the time the circuit brought a woman to her second or third town, she had generally developed her own private sense of the treatment's actual value, separate from whatever her husband's letters or her physician's reports concluded. Some found the waters and the rest genuinely restorative, returning home lighter, calmer, better able to face the household that awaited them. Others found something more complicated, a season of freedom that clarified, with uncomfortable precision, exactly how little freedom the rest of her life actually contained. The seasonal calendar governing this circuit followed its own internal logic, largely dictated by climate and by the accumulated habits of the wealthy European society that had established these resorts long before American visitors began arriving in significant numbers. Spring and early summer favoured the German spas, their gardens at their fullest bloom, their promenades most pleasant for the extended walking the cure required. Late summer often saw a migration toward the French resorts, Vichy particularly, before the circuit's more serious devotees moved on to Carlsbad for the early autumn, timing their treatment to the specific mineral properties believed most effective in that particular season. A woman who travelled this circuit for several consecutive years came to know this calendar as intimately as she had once known her household's own seasonal rhythms of entertaining and travel back home. The financial cost of this extended multi-town treatment was considerable, and it's worth remembering that this entire story, from its first chapter forward, concerns a fairly narrow slice of American society, wealthy enough to absorb months or years of hotel bills, physicians' fees, and travel expenses without meaningfully straining the household's finances. For every woman whose rest cure stretched across a full circuit of European towns, there were countless other women, in households of more modest means, whose identical exhaustion received no such elaborate remedy at all, simply absorbed, unaddressed, into the ordinary, unrelenting rhythm of their daily lives. This disparity did not go entirely unnoticed even within the period's own limited framework for discussing such things. A handful of social commentators and a smaller number of physicians writing in the medical and popular press of the era occasionally remarked on the peculiar spectacle of wealthy women travelling across an ocean for a rest that poorer women, working considerably harder under considerably worse conditions, would never be offered at all. These observations rarely developed into any sustained critique of the underlying system, but their existence suggests that even contemporaries recognise something uncomfortable in the specific shape this particular remedy took. The circuit also produced its own small industry of guidebooks and advisory literature, written specifically for the American woman planning an extended European rest cure, offering practical advice on which towns suited, which complaints, which hotels catered most attentively to invalid guests, what wardrobe and what daily supplies a well-prepared traveller ought to bring. These guidebooks, several of which survive in library collections today, read now as a strange and specific artefact of their era, treating an entire category of women's distress as a simple matter of informed consumer choice among competing resort destinations, each with its particular claimed specialty and its particular clientele. By the later years of this practice, as the new century approached, the circuit had developed enough of an established rhythm and enough of a recognizable population that it had, in its own way, become a kind of parallel society, one that existed alongside and largely separate from the ordinary social calendar these women's husbands continued to observe back home. Two entirely different versions of the same family's year were, in effect, being lived simultaneously on two different continents, connected only by the slow, careful correspondence travelling between them. The trains that carried these women between towns offered their own particular interlude within the larger rhythm of the circuit. Hours spent watching an unfamiliar countryside past the window, vineyards and small villages, and the occasional distant silhouette of a castle on a hillside, landscapes entirely unlike anything these women had grown up with, absorbed now with the particular attentiveness of someone who has, for the first time in years, nothing more pressing to occupy her thoughts than the view outside a train window. These journeys, uncomfortable as they sometimes were by later standards of travel, offered their own quiet form of the same rest the destination towns provided. Hours of unstructured, undemanding time during which nothing at all was required of her, beyond simply being carried forward. Language itself became, for many of these women, an unexpected pleasure of the circuit. The growing, hard-won familiarity with French or German phrases picked up gradually across a season of ordering meals and describing symptoms to physicians and exchanging pleasantries with hotel staff. A woman who had spent decades speaking only the practiced formal English of American drawing rooms found herself, by her second or third town, capable of simple conversations in a foreign tongue, a small but genuine accomplishment that belonged entirely to her, unconnected to any household duty or social expectation, learned purely because she had wanted to learn it. One final image from the circuit deserves holding on to: the sight, common enough at any of these towns, of a woman sitting alone on a terrace in the late afternoon, a book closed in her lap, watching the light change over the hills without any particular urgency to do anything else at all. It is a small image, almost nothing, and yet it represents something these women had rarely been permitted before: the simple, sufficient occupation of doing nothing, for no reason beyond the fact that nothing was, for once, exactly what was required of her. Consider, too, the sheer physical stamina the circuit eventually demanded, an irony worth noting given the exhaustion that had originally justified the entire enterprise. Moving between 3 or 4 towns across a single season, managing trunks and travel documents and unfamiliar transit systems in foreign languages, required an energy and a competence considerably beyond what the original diagnosis of nervous depletion would have predicted. Many women found, somewhere in the middle of their second or third town, that the person managing this complicated itinerary bore very little resemblance to the exhausted, depleted figure described in the letter that had first sent her abroad, a discrepancy that some of these women noted with a certain private wryness in their own correspondence home. As the circuit carried her from one town to the next, the specific details of each place began to blur pleasantly into a single, extended season of unhurried recovery. The particular colonnade of one town's Trinkhalle indistinguishable, in memory, from another's, the specific faces of the women she had met blending into a single, warm impression of company and understanding that no individual town's name could fully capture on its own. One final texture of the circuit deserves inclusion here: the small but meaningful economies these women developed among themselves, sharing knowledge of which shops in each town offered fair prices to foreign visitors, which local guides could be trusted to arrange a pleasant excursion without excessive markup, which laundries handled delicate fabrics with sufficient care. This practical knowledge, exchanged as freely as the more emotional confidences the circuit produced, reflects something worth noting about these women's capabilities more broadly: a resourcefulness and a competence that the original diagnosis of nervous depletion had never anticipated they would need to demonstrate, and that they demonstrated anyway repeatedly across every town the circuit carried them through. And so the circuit carried her onward, gathering into itself the accumulated rest and clarity of every previous stop, a season transformed gradually into something closer to a second life, lived quietly alongside the one still waiting for her, patiently, across the ocean. Somewhere between the German waters and the French ones, she had become, without quite intending it, a genuinely capable traveller, comfortable in her own skin in a way that no season at home had ever quite allowed her to be. Whatever town waited next on the circuit, she carried into it now a steadiness that no earlier season of her life had ever quite allowed her to develop. By the circuit's final stretch, she moved through unfamiliar stations and unfamiliar languages with an ease that would have astonished the woman who had first boarded a ship believing herself too tired to manage very much at all. Let the movement of this circuit settle into a slow rhythm now, town after town, water after water, each stop another small increment of distance from the house that sent her, another small increment of clarity about the life she was gathering the strength, or perhaps merely the permission to return to. Not every woman who crossed the Atlantic for a rescue returned to the household that had sent her. This part of the story is quieter than the rest, harder to document with certainty, because a woman who chose not to return generally did not announce her reasoning in a letter that survived for later historians to find. But the pattern is visible enough in scattered records, ship manifests that show a departure but no corresponding return, family correspondence that grows increasingly evasive about a wife's whereabouts, occasional divorce filings from this period that cite an extended absence abroad as one small piece of a larger dissolution. For some of these women, the decision was gradual rather than sudden, a slow accumulation of reasons across months or years of the circuit, until one season's planned return simply did not happen, replaced instead by a letter requesting an extension, and then another, until the extensions themselves had quietly become a kind of permanent arrangement that neither party fully acknowledged as such. A marriage does not always end with an announcement. Sometimes it ends the way this kind of separation ended, through a slow widening of distance that both parties allowed to continue, because addressing it directly would have required a confrontation neither one particularly wanted. There were women, too, whose decision not to return was considerably more deliberate. Women who had used the months or years of their rest cure to gather a clarity about their marriage that the household back home, with all its familiar demands and distractions, had never permitted them to reach. Distance, whatever its original coercive purpose, has a way of revealing things that proximity obscures. A woman who spent 2 decades inside the daily texture of an unhappy marriage, managing its logistics, performing its rituals, rarely had the uninterrupted time to sit back far enough to see the shape of the thing whole. A woman sent 3,000 miles away, with months of unstructured time and the company of other women navigating identical circumstances, sometimes found exactly that vantage point, whether anyone had intended to give it to her or not. The legal and financial realities facing a woman who chose not to return were considerably harsher than the emotional clarity that might have prompted the choice. Under the property laws still governing most American states through much of this period, a wife who left her marriage, regardless of her reasons, risked forfeiting whatever financial security the marriage had provided, and divorce, where it was even legally accessible, carried a social stigma severe enough to close most of the doors that had previously been open to her. A woman who chose to remain in Europe rather than return home was frequently choosing a kind of genteel poverty and social diminishment over a return to a marriage she had come to find intolerable, and the fact that any women made this choice at all, given the cost, says something significant about exactly how intolerable some of these marriages had become. A handful of these women managed the transition with real resourcefulness, establishing small households of their own in the towns where they had originally come to rest, sometimes supported by whatever independent income they had managed to secure before or during the marriage, sometimes supported by family members back home who understood, even if they did not say so openly, exactly why she had chosen to stay. These households, modest by the standards of the mansions many of these women had left behind, appear in later correspondence, and occasionally in the memoirs of their children as places of a very different kind of contentment, smaller, quieter, entirely her own in a way no room in her previous life had ever been. Other women who chose not to return found their way instead into second marriages, sometimes to men they had met precisely within this transatlantic society of resting Americans, other exiles, other seekers of the particular freedom that distance from home had granted them. These second marriages, when they occurred, were not always happier than the first, and the historical record includes plenty of examples where a woman traded one difficult arrangement for another. But some, by the fuller accounts that survive, found in a second marriage something genuinely different. A partnership built on mutual choice rather than the transactional arrangements of their first marriages, entered into as adults who understood exactly what they wanted and, perhaps more importantly, exactly what they would no longer tolerate. It is worth considering the children left behind by these decisions, because the choice not to return carried consequences for them as well, consequences that the historical record treats with considerably less sympathy than it extends to the mothers who made the choice. A child raised by a father and whatever household arrangement had developed in the mother's absence, occasionally growing up with only a distant, formalized correspondence connecting them to a woman they might see only rarely, if at all, for the remainder of their childhood. This was, without question, a genuine cost, borne by people who had no say in the decision that produced it, and it deserves acknowledgement rather than erasure in a story that might otherwise be tempted to read these departures too simply as triumphant escapes. The truth, as it usually is, sits somewhere more complicated than either a story of pure victimhood or a story of pure liberation. These were women navigating a set of circumstances designed, deliberately or not, to remove their voice from decisions about their own lives, who found, in the specific and strange freedom of an ocean's distance, enough room to finally exercise a choice, even when that choice came at real and lasting cost to themselves and to the people who loved them. Neither the leaving nor the staying was simple. Both required a kind of courage that the polite vocabulary of the period, rest, finishing, nervous exhaustion, was never designed to acknowledge. There is a particular kind of woman who appears repeatedly in the margins of this history, mentioned briefly in someone else's letter, a name in a ship manifest with no corresponding return voyage, a small notation in a family Bible marking a birth or a marriage that occurred an ocean away from where the family's main story continued. These are the women whose full accounts we do not have, whose reasoning we can only infer from the shape of what they left behind, and it is worth honouring, even in their absence from the fuller record, the fact that they made a choice, in an era that offered women astonishingly few genuine choices, and that the choice, whatever its cost, was finally, entirely their own. Most women, it should be said clearly, did return. The majority of this story's subjects went back to the households and the marriages that had sent them, resumed their former roles with varying degrees of resignation and genuine contentment, and lived out the remainder of their lives within the same social architecture that had produced their rescuer in the first place. The ones who did not return were the exception, not the rule, and the story would be dishonest to suggest otherwise. But the exception matters, because it reveals something about the outer edge of what this particular arrangement could produce when a woman was given, however unintentionally, enough distance and enough time to fully see her own circumstance. Whichever choice a woman ultimately made, return or remain, the months of distance had already done something that could not be undone. She had lived, for a season or for years, a life that belonged more fully to her than any life she had known before, structured by physicians and companions and the rhythms of a rescuer certainly, but free in ways her household back home had never permitted, from the constant, invisible labour of belonging entirely to other people. The legal mechanisms available to a husband whose wife chose not to return were considerably more robust than those available to the wife herself, another asymmetry embedded deeply into the marital law of the period. A husband could, in many states, pursue formal separation or divorce proceedings citing abandonment, a legal category that made no distinction between a wife who had fled genuine cruelty and a wife who had simply exercised, for the first time, an independent judgment about where and how she wished to live. The word abandonment itself carried a particular cruelty in this context, applied to women who had, in the fullest sense, been sent away first, and who were now being formally blamed, in the language of the law, for the distance that decision had ultimately produced. Family reaction to a woman's choice not to return varied considerably, shaped by the specific relationships and loyalties within each extended family network. Some parents and siblings, upon learning of a daughter's or sister's decision, offered quiet, practical support, a small allowance sent discreetly, a standing invitation to visit that implicitly acknowledged and accepted her new circumstances without requiring her to fully explain or justify them. Others responded with the era's more predictable disapproval, treating the choice as a scandal requiring careful management and, in some cases, considerable distance of their own from a relative whose decision reflected, in the judgment of the period, poorly on the whole family's respectability. There is a particular category of letter, rare but documented, in which a woman who chose to remain abroad attempted to explain her reasoning to a sister or a close friend back home, letters that offer some of the most direct and unguarded testimony available from this entire history. These letters, when they survive, describe circumstances ranging from genuine cruelty that a return home would have required resuming, to a more diffuse but no less real sense of having finally discovered, at an age when the culture around her insisted such discoveries were no longer possible, exactly what she wanted the remainder of her life to look like. It would be a mistake to read these letters as uniformly triumphant, however, and the more honest examples resist that reading entirely. Alongside the clarity and the relief, many of these women wrote candidly of grief, homesickness for a specific garden or a specific room, worry for children whose daily lives she could no longer directly witness, and a persistent uncertainty about whether the choice she had made was, in fact, the right one. A question many of these letters admit they could not fully answer even years after the decision had become final and irreversible. The financial arrangements available to a woman who chose to remain abroad varied enormously, depending on her family's specific circumstances and their willingness to continue supporting her independently of her marriage. A small number of these women had entered marriage with a personal fortune protected, at least partially, by the more progressive married women's property statutes that had begun appearing in various states from the middle of the century onward, statutes that offered a thin but real layer of financial independence, unavailable to women married under the older, stricter common law. For these women, the choice to remain abroad, while still socially costly, did not necessarily mean the complete financial precarity that faced women without any independent resources of their own. Other women, lacking this protection, relied on whatever family support they could secure, arrangements that were sometimes generous and sometimes grudging, sometimes offered openly and sometimes routed quietly through an intermediary, to avoid the appearance of open family rebellion against the husband's authority. A father or brother willing to send funds abroad, without necessarily endorsing the daughter's or sister's decision publicly, occupied a delicate position of his own, balancing family loyalty against the social risk of appearing to support what respectable society would have called an abandonment of marital duty. One final story deserves mention here, gathered second-hand from a family memoir written decades later by a granddaughter, piecing together fragments of a family legend rarely discussed openly. A great-grandmother, the memoir recorded, had gone abroad for her nerves sometime in the 1880s and simply never returned, living out the remainder of a long life in a small French coastal town, corresponding faithfully but distantly with the family she had left, remembered by later generations less as a scandal than as a kind of quiet, unexplained mystery. A woman who had, for reasons the family no longer fully understood, chosen an entirely different life. Consider, finally, what this small but significant minority reveals about the entire system this story has traced. A system confident enough in its own legitimacy does not typically produce meaningful numbers of participants who, once given the chance, choose never to return to it. That some women did choose exactly this at real and lasting cost suggests that whatever the rescuer's stated medical purpose, its practical effect, for at least some of these women, was to reveal a life so much more bearable in its absence from the original marriage that returning to it became, quite simply, no longer something they were willing to do. As with so much of this history, the fullest truth of these departures resists easy summary, existing somewhere in the quiet space between the family's version of events and whatever private reckoning the woman herself carried, a reckoning she alone, in the end, was left to hold, unwitnessed and largely unrecorded for however many years remained to her in the life she had chosen. One final consideration belongs to this account of the women who did not return, the specific courage required to make this choice within a culture that offered almost no vocabulary for describing it sympathetically. A woman who left her marriage under these circumstances had no accessible language available to explain herself that her own society would readily accept as legitimate. She could not say in any way that would be heard as reasonable within the moral framework of her time that she had simply discovered through months of genuine rest that she preferred a smaller, quieter, more genuinely her own life to the larger, more prestigious one she had been raised to want. That explanation, true as it may have been, had no respectable name in the vocabulary available to her, and so these women's choices, whatever their private clarity, were left to be misread by nearly everyone who heard of them as scandal, as abandonment, as a mystery requiring no further sympathetic examination at all. And so, for this small but genuine number of women, the story ended not with a return but with a beginning, quiet and costly and entirely their own, chosen at last after so many decisions made for them by no one but themselves. Somewhere in the quiet arithmetic of what she had gained and what she had given up, each of these women arrived, eventually, at her own private answer, one she rarely spoke aloud but carried steadily, for however many years remained to her. Whatever became of them afterward, these women had done something the record rarely credits them for. They had chosen deliberately at real cost, and had lived with that choice honestly. For every woman whose letters survive to tell even a fragment of this particular story, dozens more left no trace at all beyond a name in a ship's manifest. Their reasoning, their grief, their eventual peace or regret, lost now to a silence the historical record can no longer recover, however carefully we listen for it. Let this thought rest with you now, gently, without needing to resolve into any single conclusion. Some women went home, some did not. Both kinds of women carried afterward a version of themselves that the ocean had revealed to them, one they might never have discovered if they had never been sent away at all. It is worth stepping back now, in these quieter hours, and asking plainly what the rest cure actually accomplished, separate from the language used to justify it. The physicians of the period would have answered this question with confidence, citing improved sleep, restored appetite, a general return of vigour and calm. And in a great many documented cases this answer was not wrong. Women did return from these extended stays abroad genuinely rested, genuinely calmer, better equipped to face the households and marriages that awaited them. But rest, as any tired person eventually discovers, is rarely a simple matter of hours accumulated in a comfortable bed. What these women were given, in the specific structure of the European rest cure, was something considerably more particular than mere sleep. They were given, for the first time in most of their adult lives, a period of time that belonged to no one else's schedule. No child's needs organising the morning, no husband's business associates requiring an evening's careful hosting, no household staff awaiting direction. Time, simply, that was hers to spend however the physician's gentle regimen allowed, which turned out in practice to be considerably more freedom than most of these women had ever previously known. This raises an uncomfortable question that the medical framework of the period was never designed to ask. If the cure worked, and by many accounts it genuinely did, was it the mineral content of the waters that produced the improvement, or was it simply the removal, however temporary, of the conditions that had produced the exhaustion in the first place? The physicians of Baden-Baden and Vichy and Carlsbad would have insisted on the former. But the letters and diaries these women left behind suggest, again and again, a rather different answer. Consider what the diagnosis of neurasthenia actually described, stripped of its scientific vocabulary. A woman who managed, without pay or formal recognition, an operation as complex as a household of a dozen or more people, who bore and raised children with minimal practical support from the husband whose name the household bore, who performed the near-constant emotional labour of a marriage entered into for reasons that were frequently more financial and social than personal, and who was, in addition to all of this, expected to appear at every public occasion composed, gracious, and quietly deferential to a husband who made every major decision affecting her life without necessarily consulting her. A woman living under these conditions, exhausted by them, was not suffering from a weakness of the nerves. She was suffering from an entirely reasonable response to an entirely unreasonable set of circumstances. The genius of the neurasthenia diagnosis, if genius is the right word for something that functioned so effectively, without anyone necessarily intending its full effect, was that it relocated the source of the problem from the marriage and the household to the woman's own constitution. She was not exhausted because her circumstances demanded too much of her, without offering commensurate support or acknowledgement. She was exhausted because her nerves, delicate by virtue of her class and her sex, had simply given out under ordinary strain that a hardier woman, the diagnosis implied, would have withstood without difficulty. This reframing mattered enormously because it determined what kind of remedy seemed appropriate. A diagnosis that located the problem in the marriage would have suggested, as its remedy, changes to the marriage itself, a redistribution of labour, a husband's greater involvement in decisions that affected the household, a genuine conversation about what the wife needed and wanted from a partnership she had entered into, in most cases, with very little say in the matter to begin with. A diagnosis that located the problem in the wife's own nervous constitution suggested instead a remedy that changed nothing about the marriage or the household at all. It simply removed the wife temporarily and returned her eventually to resume exactly the same arrangement that had exhausted her the first time. It is worth noting that this pattern was not unique to marriage, though marriage is the specific arrangement this story concerns. The broader medical and social culture of the period was remarkably consistent in locating women's distress within women's own bodies and nerves, rather than within the social and legal structures that shaped their lives. A woman who found her circumstances genuinely intolerable, whatever the specific circumstances, was far more likely to be offered a diagnosis and a treatment than a structural change to the conditions producing her distress. This was true in marriages, and it was true, as later historians would document extensively, in the treatment of women's ambitions more broadly, their education, their labour, their political voice, all of it subject to a medical framework that treated female unhappiness as a matter of individual pathology rather than collective circumstance. None of this means the rest cure itself was without genuine value. This is important to hold alongside the critique, because the two things can be true simultaneously. The waters may not have possessed the specific curative properties the physicians attributed to them, but the rest, the distance, the company of other women navigating identical circumstances, the simple, radical experience of time that belonged to no one else's demands, these things produced real and lasting benefit for a great many of the women who experienced them. The cure worked, in other words, not because the diagnosis was correct, but because the treatment, almost by accident, happened to address the actual underlying condition even while misnaming it entirely. This is perhaps the central and most quietly devastating irony of the entire history this story has been tracing. An entire medical, social, and economic apparatus built around a diagnosis that misidentified the true source of these women's exhaustion, nonetheless managed through its prescribed remedy to offer genuine relief, precisely because the remedy happened to include the one thing the diagnosis itself refused to name directly: freedom, however temporary, from the exact conditions the diagnosis had been designed not to examine. What would it have looked like, one might wonder, for the physicians of this era to name the condition accurately? Not neurasthenia, but exhaustion produced by unequal labour and unacknowledged partnership. Not a weakness of the nerves, but a reasonable response to decades without meaningful say in the decisions shaping one's own life. Such a diagnosis would have required a remedy considerably more difficult to prescribe than a steamship ticket, a remedy that involved the husband's own behaviour, the structure of the marriage itself, changes that no physician of the period, however genuinely sympathetic, held the social authority to demand. It would be many decades before the language available to describe these women's condition began to catch up with the reality they were actually living. The rescue, whatever its shortcomings, at least offered something. It offered distance, and in distance, however involuntary its arrival, some of these women found a clarity that would eventually, generations later, develop into a fuller vocabulary for naming exactly what had exhausted them, and exactly what a genuine remedy might have required. The scholarship that eventually emerged many decades later to examine this period more carefully arrived at conclusions the physicians of the Gilded Age could not have reached, constrained as they were by the assumptions of their own moment. Historians studying neurasthenia and the rescue have noted, with the benefit of considerable hindsight, how closely the diagnosis tracked not with any consistent physiological marker, but with a woman's social position, her degree of autonomy within her marriage, and the specific demands placed upon her by a household and a social system that offered her responsibility without corresponding authority. The pattern, viewed from this later vantage point, looks considerably less like a medical phenomenon and considerably more like a symptom of the structural conditions themselves. It is worth considering, too, the small number of contemporary voices who came close to naming this dynamic directly, even without the fuller vocabulary later generations would develop. A handful of women writers of the period, most notably those associated with the early stirrings of what would eventually become a broader movement for women's rights, wrote with real insight about the connection between women's prescribed passivity and the nervous complaints that passivity seemed reliably to produce. Their writing rarely reached the households this story concerns directly, circulating instead within smaller, more radical circles, but its existence suggests that the connection between circumstance and symptom was visible, even at the time, to those willing to look past the comfortable medicalized explanation. The physicians who prescribe the rest cure most extensively left behind, in their own professional writing, a body of evidence that reads very differently to a modern eye than it would have read to their own contemporaries. Detailed case notes describing a patient's symptoms alongside almost no attention to her actual daily circumstances, her marriage, her household responsibilities, her own account of what troubled her, reveal in their very silences exactly how thoroughly the diagnostic framework of the period had trained physicians to look everywhere, except at the conditions most likely to have produced the exhaustion they were treating. This is not offered as a simple condemnation of the individual physicians involved, many of whom, by every available account, genuinely believed they were helping their patients, and in a great many cases actually did provide genuine relief, however partial and however misattributed to the wrong cause. The critique belongs more properly to the system as a whole, the interlocking set of medical, legal, and social assumptions that made this particular pattern of diagnosis and remedy seem not only reasonable but genuinely humane, evidence of real concern for a category of suffering that a less attentive era might simply have ignored entirely. Later medical historians examining the case records of this period have also drawn attention to how rarely the treatment addressed, even indirectly, the specific power imbalance embedded in the marriage itself. A woman returned from her rescue to precisely the same legal and financial dependency she'd left, her name still absent from the property deeds and the bank accounts that funded the household she managed, her daily decisions still subject, in any matter of real consequence, to a husband's ultimate authority. The cure treated her exhaustion as though it existed independently of these conditions, a discrete ailment to be resolved and then set aside, rather than an ongoing consequence of an ongoing arrangement that would begin, almost immediately upon her return, producing the very same exhaustion all over again. This cyclical quality in fact appears clearly in the record of the women who made this crossing repeatedly, year after year, the same diagnosis renewed, the same remedy prescribed, the same waters taken, because the underlying condition of the marriage itself had never actually changed. A treatment that required annual or biennial repetition might have prompted, in a different medical culture, some deeper inquiry into whether the remedy was addressing the true cause at all. Within this particular medical culture, however, the repetition was simply accepted as evidence of an inherently delicate constitution, requiring ongoing management, rather than evidence that the remedy itself had never been aimed at the actual source of the trouble. One final reflection belongs here before this chapter closes. To call the entire system a deception would flatten something more complicated, and, in its way, more human than deception alone could capture. It was, more precisely, a shared blindness, sustained by physicians who believed genuinely in their science, husbands who believed genuinely in their concern, and a culture that had not yet developed the vocabulary to see clearly what it was actually looking at. The blindness caused real harm. It also, almost by accident, sometimes produced real rest. Both things belong in the honest telling of this history. Consider, too, how this entire pattern anticipated, in its own imperfect way, ideas that would not be articulated clearly in medical or feminist thought for many more decades. The notion that a person's environment and social role could produce genuine physiological and psychological distress independent of any inherent individual weakness. The rescuer's physicians never framed their work in these terms, and would likely have rejected the framing if it had been offered to them. And yet the practical structure of their treatment, remove the patient from the environment, observe genuine improvement, return her eventually to circumstances largely unchanged, constitutes, almost despite itself, a kind of unintentional evidence for exactly the environmental explanation the era's medical thinking refused to consider directly. As this chapter's reflection draws to its close, it is worth simply naming, plainly and without further elaboration, the two truths that must be held together to understand this history honestly. The remedy was built on a partial and self-serving diagnosis. The rest it provided was, for many of these women, genuinely and importantly real. Neither truth cancels the other. Both belong side by side in any honest accounting of what actually happened to these women, and why. One further reflection deserves inclusion before this chapter's close: the way this entire history illuminates something enduring about the relationship between naming a problem correctly and solving it effectively. A society capable of recognizing genuine exhaustion, but unwilling to examine its true structural causes, will, again and again, produce remedies that treat the symptom while leaving the underlying condition fully intact, remedies that may still offer genuine, if partial, relief. But that will always require repeating, because the actual source of the trouble was never honestly confronted in the first place. This pattern, visible so clearly across the specific history of the Gilded Age rescuer, is not confined to that particular era or that particular diagnosis. It recurs in various forms whenever a society finds it easier to treat an individual's distress than to examine the conditions that reliably produce it. And so the water cure stands, in the end, as both remedy and evidence, offering real relief while quietly revealing, to anyone willing to look closely enough at the pattern, exactly what these women had actually been missing all along. Somewhere between the diagnosis and the destination, a genuine truth kept surfacing anyway, quietly, almost despite the system built around suppressing it, that these women simply needed rest, offered honestly, without the elaborate machinery of misnaming required to grant it. Whatever the physicians called it, whatever the husbands believed, the rest itself remained simple and true beneath all the careful vocabulary layered on top of it. The waters themselves, whatever their true mineral properties, will likely never fully explain why so many of these women returned home lighter. The rest explains it. The rest was the medicine, misfiled under a stranger name. This is, in the end, the fullest honesty this history can offer. A system that got the diagnosis wrong and the remedy, almost by accident, half right. Let this understanding settle over you now without urgency, the way understanding of this kind should settle, slowly, without needing to resolve into anger or grief before sleep arrives. These women found, in an imperfect system built on a partial truth, something real enough to carry them through. That is worth honouring even as the fuller truth of what they needed remains in its way, still worth naming clearly. The voyage home carried a different quality than the voyage out had carried months earlier, in a season that already felt to her like it belonged to someone else's life. She had boarded the eastbound ship as a patient, a diagnosis, a woman whose trunks had been packed by other hands for reasons she had not fully chosen. She boarded the westbound ship whenever her particular return finally came, as someone considerably harder to categorize, rested in body certainly, but changed in ways the physician's discharge letter, however carefully worded, could never quite capture. She packed her own trunks this time, or at least directed their packing herself, a small but significant difference from the departure that had begun this story. The gowns folded away included some acquired during the months abroad, a dress from a Paris shop she had visited with her companion on an afternoon that belonged entirely to the two of them, a small collection of items that had nothing to do with rescuers or physicians' recommendations, and everything to do with a woman who had, somewhere in the preceding months, begun making small decisions purely because she wanted to. The crossing itself unfolded with a familiar rhythm now, the same promenade deck, the same dining saloon, the same slow processional of resting women, though this time she recognized the pattern from the inside, understanding exactly what circumstance had likely placed each of these women aboard, exchanging the same coded conversations she had once found bewildering, and now navigated with the ease of someone fluent in a language she had not known existed a year earlier. As the ship approached the American coast, she would have felt, by the accounts that survive, a complicated mixture of emotions that resist easy summary. Genuine longing for her children, sharpened now by months of separation into something considerably more acute than the ordinary daily missing that had characterized her life at home. Curiosity and a degree of apprehension about exactly what she would find in a household that had, by her own careful observation across months of letters, clearly continued and adapted in her absence. And beneath both of these something quieter and harder to name, a private, unspoken awareness that she was returning as someone different from the woman who had left, and an uncertainty about whether the household waiting for her had any place prepared for that difference. The dock itself, when the ship finally arrived, offered its own small revelation, the specific configuration of who had come to meet her, A husband present at the pier, warm and attentive, suggested one kind of homecoming. A husband absent, with only a carriage and driver sent in his place, suggested another, and the correspondence of the period includes examples of both, alongside every gradation between them. The children, when they were brought to the dock, provided their own honest and uncomplicated joy, unfiltered by any of the careful social calibration that governed the adults' reunion, and it was frequently in their reaction, rather than in her husband's, that a returning mother found the truest measure of how deeply she had been missed. The house itself, upon arrival, rarely looked exactly as she had left it. Small changes accumulated across months become, when encountered all at once, a fairly significant transformation, and many women describe, in later letters and diaries, a strange, disorienting quality to walking through rooms that were simultaneously entirely familiar and subtly, persistently wrong. A chair moved from its accustomed place, a new arrangement of the household staff's duties that no longer matched her previous instructions. Small evidence, everywhere she looked, that the house had continued its life without requiring her specific presence to guide it. This disorientation, uncomfortable as it was, also carried within it something valuable, though it would have taken most of these women some time to recognize it as such. The household's demonstrated capacity to function without her specific constant management suggested a possibility that her previous exhaustion had never permitted her to consider. Perhaps the labour did not need to fall entirely to her. Perhaps the household staff, given clear direction and appropriate trust, could manage considerably more of the daily operation than she had previously allowed them to manage, freeing her own attention for something other than the endless, granular oversight that had characterized her role before she left. Some women returned home and used exactly this insight to reorganize their households along genuinely different lines, delegating more, overseeing less minutely, reserving for themselves a portion of each day that resembled in its structure, if not its scale, the unstructured rest that had characterized her months abroad. These women, by the fuller accounts that survive, often reported a marriage and a household life considerably more sustainable than the one that had originally sent them away, not because the marriage itself had fundamentally changed, but because the wife had returned with a clearer sense of what she needed to protect for herself and the practical confidence, gained abroad, to actually protect it. Other women returned to find that nothing, in any meaningful sense, had changed, that the household resumed its previous patterns almost immediately, absorbing her back into exactly the role she had occupied before her departure, as though the months abroad had been merely a pause rather than any kind of genuine transformation. For these women, the rescuer's benefit, whatever its immediate physical effect, faded within weeks or months of return, the underlying conditions that had produced the original exhaustion reasserting themselves with a persistence that no amount of European mineral water had actually addressed. The marriage itself, in the weeks following a return, required its own careful renegotiation, conducted mostly without direct conversation, in the particular indirect language that governed so much of these households' emotional life. A husband's attentiveness, or its absence, a wife's willingness to resume her previous social duties with her previous enthusiasm, or a new, harder-to-name reluctance that she herself might not have been able to fully explain. These small signals, exchanged across the first weeks of reunion, established, without either party naming it directly, what kind of marriage would continue from this point forward. For a portion of these women, the return brought a genuine and lasting improvement in the marriage itself, a husband who had, in his wife's absence, come to a clearer appreciation of exactly how much her presence and her labour had actually held together, and who returned to the reunited household with a genuine intention to share the burden more equitably than he had before. This outcome exists in the record, alongside all the others, and it deserves acknowledgement, because not every story this particular history produced ended in disappointment or quiet resignation. The first dinner party hosted after a wife's return often carried a particular symbolic weight within these households. A public reintroduction of the household's proper order, the wife restored to her customary place at the table, the customary hostess of the customary rituals that had defined her social role for decades. Guests arriving for this occasion would have understood, without anyone needing to say so directly, that they were witnessing a kind of quiet restoration, and their own behaviour. Their compliments on her evident improvement, their careful avoidance of any direct reference to the specific circumstances of her absence, followed a social script nearly as rehearsed as the departure itself had been. For the servants who had managed the household during her absence, her return required its own adjustment, a return to instructions and oversight that some had grown accustomed to receiving from other sources during the intervening months. A skilled and diplomatic household staff generally navigated this transition smoothly, resuming their previous patterns of deference with practiced ease, but the historical record includes occasional glimpses of friction. A housekeeper who had grown accustomed to a freer hand finding the returning mistress's renewed attention to household detail somewhat harder to accommodate than she might have anticipated. Physically, many of these women did return genuinely transformed, a fact their own household staff and social circle often remarked upon in terms that, however superficial, pointed towards something real. Improved colour, a steadier gait, a calmer manner at the dinner table. These visible changes offered the clearest available evidence to a society that trusted visible evidence above nearly all else that the elaborate and expensive treatment had been worthwhile. Whatever the deeper questions this story has raised about the diagnosis's accuracy, the physical fact of genuine rest, sustained across months rather than snatched in stolen minutes, produced real and visible results that even the most sceptical observer could not entirely dismiss. The correspondence that continued after a woman's return, letters to the friends made abroad, to the companion who had accompanied her, to the other women of the Society of the Centreway scattered now back to their own separate households across the country and across Europe, kept alive in however attenuated a form the connections and the clarity that the months away had produced. These continuing friendships, maintained across years and sometimes decades through occasional letters, served as a kind of ongoing thread back to the version of herself she'd discovered abroad. A reminder, arriving every few months in an envelope bearing a familiar hand, that the woman who had walked those European promenades still existed, somewhere beneath the resumed rhythms of her restored domestic life. There is a small specific detail that recurs across several of the surviving accounts of these homecomings, worth noting for its quiet significance. Many of these women describe, in their own private writing, a particular attentiveness in the first days home to the sounds of the house, the specific creak of a particular stair, the particular way the light fell through a familiar window at a familiar hour, details so ordinary they would never have merited comment before her departure, but that now, freshly noticed after months away, carried an unexpected tenderness. Absence, whatever else it does, has a way of restoring a person's capacity to actually see what familiarity had rendered invisible. The renegotiation of household authority that followed a wife's return sometimes extended, in a handful of documented cases, to genuine and lasting changes in how decisions were made going forward. A husband who had discovered, across months of managing alone, a new respect for tasks he had previously taken entirely for granted, proposing upon his wife's return a more collaborative approach to matters he had once handled, or mishandled, without her input at all. These changes, where they occurred, rarely announced themselves as a deliberate reform. They emerged instead through small accumulated gestures, a decision deferred until she could be consulted, a task quietly retained by the husband that had previously fallen to her by unquestioned default. One final image belongs to this account of return, the specific moment, described in more than one surviving letter, of a mother reunited with a sleeping child too young to have been woken for the homecoming, standing quietly at the edge of a familiar nursery, watching a small chest rise and fall in the dark, needing nothing more from that entire complicated evening than this one unremarkable, ordinary sight, restored to her at last. Consider, finally, how differently each of these homecomings might have unfolded if the household itself had approached the entire episode, from diagnosis through departure through eventual return, as an occasion for genuine conversation, rather than a sequence of decisions made largely around her rather than with her. A handful of the more thoughtful households of this period did exactly this, treating the wife's return as an opportunity to genuinely ask what had helped, what she wanted to be different going forward, what the months of distance had taught her about her own needs. These conversations, rare as they were within the broader pattern this story has traced, offer a glimpse of what a genuinely different outcome might have looked like had the entire system been built around listening from the very beginning. As the first days of return gave way to the first ordinary weeks, the household gradually resumed a shape that would come, eventually, to feel simply like her life again. Whatever quiet differences lingered beneath its familiar surface, and she carried forward into whatever years remained to her both the household she had returned to and the woman the distance had allowed her, briefly, to become. One further scene belongs to this account of return, the first proper night's sleep in her own bed, in her own room, after months of hotel rooms and shared cabins, and the particular unfamiliarity of beds that belonged, however comfortably, to someone else. Many of these women describe this specific sleep in the letters and diaries that survive, with an attention to detail that suggests just how significant a simple, familiar bed had become after so long away from it, the particular give of a mattress shaped by years of her own weight, the particular quality of light through curtains she had chosen herself, small physical facts that no European hotel, however luxurious, had ever quite been able to replicate. And so she settled, gradually, back into the shape of her old life, carrying within her, quietly and permanently, the shape of the other life she had briefly known, the two versions of herself continuing on together, unremarked, beneath the surface of her restored and ordinary days. Somewhere in the quiet weeks that followed, the household found its new equilibrium, neither quite what it had been before her departure nor quite what it had become in her absence, but something gently reconciled between the two. Whatever waited beyond that first quiet night, she had at least this, a bed, a room, a house that had missed her in its own quiet way, exactly as much as she had missed it. In the weeks that followed her return, she would find herself more than once standing quietly in a doorway of her own house, simply looking the way a person looks at something they once nearly lost and have only just gotten back. Let the uncertainty of this homecoming rest gently with you now, unresolved, because it was unresolved for her too, in that first quiet evening back in her own bedroom, lying in a bed that was hers again, in a house that had learned, whether she liked it or not, that it could continue without her. Whatever waited in the months ahead, tonight there was only this, the specific, complicated relief of being home, and the quiet, private knowledge, carried back across an ocean, that she was not quite the same woman who had left it. What survives of these women, in the end, is scattered and incomplete, the way most ordinary lives are scattered and incomplete in the historical record, no matter how much wealth or social prominence surrounded them while they lived. A handful of diaries, preserved by descendants who understood their value, a cluster of letters kept in a family archive or donated eventually to a historical society, a ship manifest here, a hotel register there, a physician's casebook that happened to survive when so many others were discarded. From these fragments, a pattern becomes visible, even when no single complete story does. The pattern is this. Somewhere between the 1870s and the years just before the First World War reorganized the entire world these women had known, a significant number of American wives, most of them somewhere in their 40s, most of them married for 2 decades or more, most of them managing households of considerable size and complexity, were diagnosed with a nervous exhaustion that originated less in their own bodies than in the accumulated, unacknowledged weight of lives spent entirely in service to other people's needs, and the remedy prescribed for this exhaustion, again and again, across hundreds of documented cases and surely many more that left no trace at all, was distance. An ocean's worth of it if the family could afford the crossing. It would be simple and not entirely inaccurate to tell this story as one of pure exploitation, husbands using a fashionable diagnosis to remove inconvenient wives from households they wished to reorganize without interference. That story exists within this larger history, documented clearly enough in some cases that the coercion requires no interpretation at all. But it would also be incomplete, because it would erase the women who found, within this imperfect and sometimes cynically deployed system, something genuinely valuable, rest that restored them, distance that clarified them, friendships that sustained them long after the specific circumstances that produced those friendships had passed. It would be equally simple and equally incomplete to tell this story as one of straightforward liberation, wealthy women granted an unexpected European holiday under the cover of medical necessity. That story too exists within the larger history, documented in the letters of women who genuinely treasured their months abroad and returned home reluctantly, if at all. But it erases the genuine grief of women separated from children they loved, the genuine anger of women who understood with painful clarity exactly why they had been sent away and exactly whose convenience the arrangement primarily served. The truest version of this history holds both of these stories simultaneously, resists the temptation to resolve into a single clean narrative, and asks instead what it meant for an entire generation of women to have their exhaustion treated as a medical condition requiring geographic exile rather than a reasonable response to circumstances that no one in a position of authority was willing to examine directly. This is, in its way, a story about the limits of what a society can offer women when it refuses to name honestly what those women actually need. What these women carried home, whatever the specific balance of relief and grief their individual journeys produced, was rarely visible in any obvious way. There was no dramatic transformation, no sudden reversal of the household hierarchy that had sent them away in the first place. What changed in most cases was quieter and more internal, a private, hard-won knowledge of exactly how much of themselves they had been carrying alone, and exactly what it felt like, however briefly, to set some portion of that weight down. Some of these women used this knowledge to reshape in small and careful ways the remaining years of their marriages, claiming more rest, more autonomy, more genuine partnership than they had previously believed themselves entitled to request. Others found the knowledge harder to translate into lasting change, returning to households and marriages that reabsorbed them into their previous patterns with a persistence no season of European rest could ultimately withstand. And a smaller number, as this story has already traced, used the knowledge to choose, at real cost, a different life entirely, one that belonged more fully to themselves than any life available to them within their original marriage. Their daughters, in many cases, would grow up to inherit a world beginning, slowly and unevenly, to offer women something closer to the structural changes their mother's generation had never been offered directly. Wider access to education, the vote, arriving within a couple of decades of this story's final chapters, legal reforms, gradual and incomplete but real, chipping away at the coverture doctrine that had once rendered a married woman legally invisible in her own financial life. None of this arrived quickly enough to help the women whose rest cures fill the preceding chapters, but it arrived, in part because women of exactly this generation had begun, in hotel parlours and steamship dining rooms and quiet late-night diary entries, to name what they were actually experiencing, even without the fuller vocabulary that later generations would develop to describe it precisely. The spa towns themselves continued for decades after this particular chapter of their history closed, though the specific population that had defined this era, the resting American wives of the Gilded Age, gradually gave way to different visitors, different reasons for travel, a different century's version of what rest and recovery required. Baden-Baden still stands today, its Trinkhalle still pouring the same mineral waters, its Lichtenthaler Alley still offering the same mile-and-a-half of unhurried walking beside the same small river. Vichy and Carlsbad, under their various names across the political changes of the intervening century, continue to draw visitors seeking exactly the kind of restorative distance this story's women once sought, though few of today's visitors arrive carrying quite the same particular, unspoken history. What remains in the end is the pattern itself, visible across enough individual stories to constitute something larger than any single woman's experience. A generation of wives, exhausted by lives spent entirely in service to households, and marriages that rarely returned that labour in kind, offered a remedy that misnamed their condition, even while, almost despite itself, offering some genuine relief. Women who crossed an ocean, not because they chose to in most cases, but who found, once they arrived, something they had not expected to find waiting for them there. Time, distance, each other. And, in the quiet, unhurried rhythm of a life finally permitted to slow down, a version of themselves they had not had the chance to meet in a very long time. Whatever became of any single woman in this story, whether she returned gladly, returned reluctantly, or did not return at all, she carried something home that no customs official ever inventoried, and no ship's manifest ever recorded. A knowledge, however quietly held, that her exhaustion had been real, that her needs had been real, and that somewhere across an ocean, in the specific hard-won stillness of a rest she had not chosen but had ultimately claimed as her own, she had been for a season entirely and simply herself. It is worth returning in these final quiet pages to the specific woman who began this story, standing in the hallway of her own house on an early autumn morning, watching the carriage wait at the curb, her trunks already closed and labelled by hands other than her own. She was not one particular historical figure whose full biography survives intact somewhere in an archive, but a composite drawn honestly from the documented patterns of hundreds of women very much like her, women whose individual names have mostly faded from any record beyond a ship's manifest or a hotel's guest ledger, but whose collective experience left a pattern clear enough, 2 centuries later, to reconstruct with real confidence. She represents, in this sense, not a single life but a genuine historical current, one that ran quietly beneath the more visible narratives of Gilded Age wealth and display that have received considerably more attention in the years since. The grand balls, the transatlantic marriages of young heiresses to titled Europeans, the vast fortunes built and occasionally lost within a single generation, these stories have been told and retold, dramatised and studied, their central figures remembered by name. The women of this particular story, the middle-aged wives quietly sent abroad for their nerves, occupy a considerably quieter corner of the same history, their departures rarely announced with the fanfare of a society wedding, their return home rarely marked by any public acknowledgement of what the intervening months had actually meant. And yet their story matters precisely because of this quietness, because it reveals something about the ordinary undramatic mechanics of power within even the most privileged Gilded Age marriages, mechanics that operated not through cruelty announced or acknowledged, but through 1,000 small reasonable-seeming decisions, a physician's diagnosis, a steamship ticket, a companion engaged to ensure appropriate supervision, each one defensible on its own terms, each one contributing to a pattern that, viewed as a whole across an entire generation of women, looks considerably less benign than any single decision within it. Their daughters and granddaughters would inherit a world that remembered this pattern only dimly, if at all, the specific vocabulary of neurasthenia, and the rest cure fading from medical practice by the early decades of the 20th century, replaced eventually by different diagnostic categories, different assumptions about women's nervous constitution, different remedies prescribed for exhaustion and unhappiness that the underlying social conditions continued, in various evolving forms, to produce. The specific ships and the specific spa towns of this story belong now to history, but the underlying pattern they represent, exhaustion produced by unequal labour and unacknowledged partnership, remains recognisable enough in its more modern forms that this 2-century-old story still carries something worth sitting with tonight. It is worth acknowledging one final time the limits of what any single story like this one can actually recover. The women themselves left behind fragments, not complete accounts, and the historian or storyteller working from those fragments inevitably fills gaps with informed inference rather than certain fact. This particular telling has tried to hold that honestly, offering a pattern reconstructed from genuine historical evidence, a composite portrait rather than a single verified biography, because the fuller truth of any individual woman's specific experience is, in most cases, simply lost to us now, carried away with her, undocumented, into whatever remained of her life after the story recorded here concluded. What remains recoverable, and what this story has tried to honour throughout, is the pattern itself, visible clearly enough across the surviving evidence to constitute a genuine historical phenomenon rather than a single unusual case. An entire generation of women, exhausted by circumstances their culture refused to examine honestly, offered a remedy that misnamed the problem even while, almost accidentally, addressing a genuine piece of it. Their individual names may be lost, the shape of what happened to them collectively is not. And so this story closes the way it began, not with a single dramatic conclusion, but with a quiet accumulation of small ordinary moments, a trunk closed, a ship boarded, a water taken, a letter written, a house rearranged, a return made or not made, each one small enough on its own, each one part of something considerably larger when held together, and finally, gently, seen. Consider, one final time, what it might mean to carry this story forward into your own understanding of rest itself, not as something granted only after collapse has already occurred, not as something requiring a diagnosis, a physician's permission, an ocean's distance to justify, but as something owed, quietly and regularly, to anyone who carries the daily unglamorous weight of caring for other people. The women of this story did not have the language or the standing to ask for that directly. Perhaps in the simple, unhurried act of hearing their story through to its end tonight, some small measure of that asking has finally, gently, been done on their behalf. As these final pages close, let the whole shape of the story settle over you one last time. The trunk, the ship, the waters, the letters, the companions, the house left behind and the house returned to, each piece small on its own, all of them together forming a history worth having carried this far into the night with you. One final thought, before this history finally closes, belongs to the reader hearing it now, however far removed in circumstance and century from the women who lived it. Whatever exhaustion you carry into tonight, however it arrived, whatever name has or has not been given to it, it is real, and it deserves more than a name. It deserves, simply, rest, offered without needing to be earned through collapse, without needing a physician's permission or an ocean's distance to justify it. That is the quiet inheritance this story leaves behind, gathered across 2 centuries and passed forward, gently, into whatever rest awaits you now. And so this history, gathered from fragments and letters and the quiet, patient work of reconstruction, comes finally to rest, the way its subjects themselves so rarely were permitted to, gently and without further demand upon you. Somewhere in this quiet, gathered history, 100 forgotten women finally receive something they were rarely given while they lived, a patient, unhurried hearing, offered now, long after it could reach them, but offered honestly all the same. Whatever else remains uncertain about this history, this much is not. They rested eventually, however strangely the rest arrived, and that much at least was truly theirs. This story, gathered from ship manifests and hotel ledgers, and the careful, patient work of piecing together what remains, ends now the way each of these women's own seasons abroad eventually ended, quietly, without fanfare, simply grateful for the rest that was finally, however, belatedly given. Let that be the last thought you carry into sleep tonight. Not the injustice of how she arrived there, not the uncertainty of what waited for her when she returned, only the quiet, private fact of the rest itself, real and hers, however it came to her, however long it lasted, however far from home she had to travel to finally find it. The ship has gone quiet now. Somewhere below the engines still turn, patient and unhurried, carrying you forward through dark water toward a shore you do not need to think about yet. The trunk with its brass latches is closed in the hold, wherever it is, holding whatever it was ever meant to hold. The house you left is far behind you, breathing on its own, and the house waiting ahead of you does not need to be imagined in any detail tonight. There is only this, the slow roll of the water beneath you, the dim, warm light of the cabin, low enough now to close your eyes against, the particular hard-won stillness of a room with a closed door, no one on the other side of it requiring anything from you until morning, and even then, no urgency, no schedule you have not chosen yourself. Let your breathing slow to match the engines. Let your shoulders soften into the berth beneath you. Whatever brought you onto this water tonight, whatever word was used to describe it, rest, finishing, restoration, none of it matters now nearly as much as the water itself, wide and dark and carrying you gently forward, asking nothing of you at all. Somewhere ahead, a spa town is waiting, its waters warm, its mornings unhurried, its evenings soft with music you do not need to listen to closely. Somewhere ahead, other women are walking slow circles along a river path, in no particular hurry to arrive anywhere at all. You'll meet them eventually. Tonight, you need only rest. The porthole beside you shows nothing but darkness and, faintly, the reflection of the small lamp still burning by your bed. Let it burn a little longer if you like, or let it go now. The ship will carry you either way. The water does not need your attention to keep moving, it only needs you to let it. Sleep now, gently, the way she finally slept, somewhere over that same dark water, a long time ago, carried forward by a rest she did not choose but came, in the end, to hold as entirely her own. If you liked this video, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious about that. And if you have a suggested topic, feel free to leave it in the comments.